Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. We have a full day of, or a full morning of, I hope, exciting and invigorating, and I think much needed conversations. So I'm going to sort of get out of the way and get the program underway as soon as possible. I did want to say for our online audience, there are 3 ways to submit a question. You can comment in the YouTube chat window. You can tweet at CGDev. You can use hashtag CGDTalks, or email us at events@cgdev.org. With that, without further ado, I'd like to invite Kehinde Ajayi, who's a senior fellow and the Gender Program Director at CGD.
Thank you, Ishani. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to CGD's 9th Annual Birdsall House Conference. The Birdsall House Conference is named after CGD's founding president, Nancy Birdsall, and we are honored to have her here with us today. Since its launch in 2015, this conference has highlighted research on gender equality, providing cutting-edge evidence on ways to promote gender equality and inclusion across the globe. Although we come together annually at this time to highlight an issue of specific focus, this year looking at women's leadership in international financial institutions, throughout the year, we work to produce research, develop actionable policy recommendations, and build partnerships to strengthen the promotion of economic empowerment and broader gender equality and inclusion in the global development system. So we'd like to take some time today to thank you all for engaging with us, partnering with us, supporting us in this work. We've been fully virtual in the Birdsall House Conference for the past 3 years, so it's especially delightful to be able to gather with you here in person today, and also to have all of you joining online. Thank you to all of you who are here with us. For those of you who've attended this conference in the past, we welcome you back. It's great to see you here again. For those of you for whom this is the first time, we hope this will be the first of many other years of coming together to exchange, engage in impactful conversations to improve the status of gender equality across the globe. We have an incredible lineup of speakers for you today. Thank you, Ishani, for putting together this wonderful lineup. Thank you to all of you who are joining us to share your perspectives, your stories, and to engage in this conversation. To get us started, I'd like to invite CGD's president, Masood Ahmed, to share some opening remarks. Thank you.
After Ishani, I always have to lower the mic. Sorry, after Kehinde, I meant to say. So thank you very much, Kehinde. Thank you, Ishani. Thank you all for being here. I wanted to add my own welcome to what Kehinde just said, to all of you for being here today, and also to all the people that are online. So today we're going to focus on the major IFIs. Try and take a look and see how far they have come in terms of moving ahead with towards gender parity or at gender. I say towards because you'll find out soon that none of them are at gender parity in management. And I want to say a couple of things. One is, why this focus on IFIs? Partly because we at CGD really do think that the IFIs play a very important role, and play an important role in terms of finance. I mean, if you include the IMF, look at 2022, they moved directly about $300 billion. And of course, associated with that is a lot of financing from others. But they also play a role in terms of being a place which serves as a microcosm of how people see international development. And for many people, particularly for many women in developing countries, so the IFIs are sort of like an aspirational thing. So leadership in the IFIs is for them playing an aspirational role. And of course, many leaders from the IFIs go on to play big roles in developing countries in different roles as well. So there's sort of societal spillover. I would have talked about why diversity is important. made the usual points that everybody in this room has already heard. Why it leads to better decision making, why it's important in terms of having lived experiences of different people, different types, be present when policies are made. But I'm also beginning to wonder whether the moment has come for us to stop making the case as to why diversity is important. Actually ask people to make the case as to why they think lack of diversity is okay. I'm sort of done a bit with making this case. We've been doing this for over a decade, and the evidence is so overwhelming now. And so my question, really my challenge is to the people who think actually lack of diversity or the inadequate progress we have made is fine, to make that case. Explain to me and to all of us why that is okay. And I really do think that maybe we have to start challenging a little bit more the people who are still, at least by their actions, if not by their words. And I do think often it's, people will agree with you on all the intellectual stuff, but then when they have to follow through, they start coming up with completely spurious arguments about, well, you've heard all the spurious arguments, so I won't spend time on them. And I think that is actually still the case. So one of the things we need to stop kidding ourselves is to think that everyone is now bought into this. They're not bought into it. And even if intellectually most people will say they're bought into it, their actions do not demonstrate that they have bought into this existentially yet and emotionally. So I really think that we need to maybe shift a little bit the balance in terms of being a bit more challenging and a bit less now simply providing evidence. Now, having said that, this is not a great setup for you, Ishani, because you're actually going to provide us with compelling evidence. And it's always good to have the evidence at hand. So what I'd like to do is really now invite Ishani to come and share with you the findings of where things stand. And as I said, we're going to find that progress has been uneven. Nobody's quite where they need to be. Some people have made more progress. Some institutions have made more progress than others. But there's a way to go. And I would like to say that once we've had that, then I'm really looking forward to this first panel, because you're all the people that are going to be in this panel are people who have managed, notwithstanding that context, notwithstanding the barriers that exist in their own institutions, to have got to levels of leadership. And I hope you will share not just your secrets of success, but also some of the challenges that you faced. Where did you get the help that helped you to get over when you got stuck at various points? What can you share with others? And then I'm also very much looking forward to the next panel, because the next panel are people who are still midway up that. And it'd be very interesting to see whether the challenges and barriers they face today are different from the ones that you faced, or whether actually they're just different versions of the same challenges and barriers, and how they're coping with that. So today should be a really exciting morning. Really looking forward to it. I'm going to turn it over to you, Shai, now. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Masood, for the framing, or lack thereof. I'm not going to justify why diversity is important, but I'm going to show you, building on work that Brian Webster, Charles Kenny, and I have been doing, analyzing data from 7 major IFIs, that while a lot of progress has been made toward gender parity, especially in managerial roles at IFIs, a lot remains to be done. We're far from where I certainly thought we were, not even hoped, but thought where we were. So let's start. So here's just a brief overview. So those of you in the front, there's the screens to the sides. We asked for staffing data from 9 major IFIs. We asked for anonymized aggregated data, so gender by grade effectively, going back to 1970. We received data from 7 of these 9, well actually 8. The African Development Bank shared incomplete data, so we're not able to include them. But the data that I'll present build on complete data that we received from the Asian Development Bank, the EIB, the EBRD, the IDB, the IMF, the Islamic Development Bank, and the World Bank. What we received, unsurprisingly, were varying time series with varying definitions of senior management and management. And of course, within the IFIs, there have been changes as well over time. So a major part of our effort was data harmonization. And at some point, with the IFI's approval, we will be sharing the data and code because we do think this is, we're bringing sort of more data to the table, to this conversation. And that's a value in itself. The final data set that I'm going to be talking about today spans 20 years, approximately from 2000 to 2023. On average, there are 27,895 IFI employees in each of these years. The largest year that we have is the last one, which is 2023, and there are 33,775 employees. So this is also just a lot of people. It's a lot of very highly accomplished people. To give you a quick overview of what we find, the first finding is, as Masood sort of spoiled, is a lack of representation at higher ranks. We see that only 1/3 of all IFI managers are women as of 2023, or the last year, which is no later than 2020 for all of these IFIs. That said, there are improving trajectories, including for women's representation in leadership. But in senior management in particular, the level has stagnated since 2010. There's always greater representation the lower down the ladder you go, so there is greater representation. The greatest representation is in general services and admin support categories, near occupational segregation there, and I'll touch upon that shortly. In lower professional ranks, in sort of middle management than senior management. And so it's always sort of, with a few exceptions, a tightening funnel. We also find evidence of a clogged pipeline. So there is a smaller share of women in management than in the feeder grades immediately below managerial roles. We see that periods of rapid change coincide with backsliding on diversity. Now, I'm not making a causal claim here. I'm just saying that when there is something happening at the institutional level, that could be a contraction, that could be a reorganization, that could be rapid growth even. Somehow that results in a smaller share of women in that IFI's workforce. Something to keep in mind. Again, as Masood spoiled, we see uneven progress. There are periods of stagnation that sort of break up spurts of growth. And we think this highlights the importance of keeping the focus on getting to gender parity, especially in management roles. Because the moment you take your eyes off it, you end up with a 4-year period with absolutely no growth, or very little growth at least. And then finally, we see that the politically appointed positions, and we're going to talk primarily about executive boards and boards of directors, are even further from parity than the technocratically filled managerial cadres that come from within the IFI's own workforces. Here's the first finding. So we see that only 1/3 of all managers are women. That those are the green and orange lines. So we have senior manager data, senior manager sort of breakdowns for chunks of time for a couple more IFIs, but there are only 3 that gave us year by year. And so the orange line is only averaging across those 3 institutions. But for both the green line, which is all managers, which we have for all IFIs, and for senior managers for the ADB, the IDB, and the World Bank, we see not even 40% of managerial positions are held by women. Many IFIs have actually reached parity, and some large ones have crossed parity for women in professional grades. And that is an encouraging sign, although I'll come back to this in a bit. And then, as I said, there's near occupational, complete occupational segregation in the administrative support categories. And this in itself, the literature on occupational segregation tells us about the sorts of impacts that this can have on perceptions around a woman's role in the workforce, on the stereotypes it might create, and the sort of the mental effects that can have on women in the workforce. So some things to keep in mind. Like I said, improving trajectories, especially for all managerial positions, but for senior management, I'm going to try, and I did not do a great job in my practice runs, but for the senior management, you see, that where we are now in 2020, 2023 is not that different from where we were in 2010. So there really has been a stagnation, and we're going to talk a little bit about what might be going on, but I think this really motivates the need for this first panel, where we're going to talk about the sorts of things that institutions have been doing and that they can do more of and better. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time here on this slide because I think this tells a really important story, and that's of a clogged pipeline from technical grades into managerial ones, using data from the World Bank and from the IMF. So the World Bank is the purple waterfall graph on your left, and the IMF is the gray one in grayscale on your right. We don't have age data. We didn't request it, and so this is the best we can do, sort of bin into 10-year cohorts. And so for each of these IFIs, we're going to look at the entry cohort, sort of the GF cohort at the World Bank, which is the entry professional grade, that is management track, if you will. In 2002, that's sort of the gray or light lilac. In the middle is 2012, and then 2022 is the most recent data, is in purple. And then similarly for the IMF, we have 2000, 2010, and 2020. And so if you think of these cohorts as sort of moving together over time, across that management pipeline in 10-year intervals, we think this tells us some pretty interesting stories. But before I get into the findings, I do want to ask sort of a philosophical question. So far, the implicit line that I have used, the implicit benchmark for gender parity, is the literal one, 50%. Now, a lot of people might say, there aren't, for example, 50% of the new recipients of econ PhDs in macroeconomics aren't women. So is it fair to use that 50% threshold as the definition of parity? I think it's fair, but for the sake of discussion, I'll propose a slightly more generous one, which is promoting from one rank to the next at the rate at which you had women available in that lower rank, in that feeder rank. And that's not what we see is happening here. So look at the 2002 GF cohort for the World Bank. Again, that is the entry-level cohort. That becomes, if you will, the 2012, so the middle GG cohort at the World Bank, and the 2022 GH cohort as they're sort of moving through. What we see is, even in 2002, the World Bank is almost at parity at entry, right? They're just short of parity. But then, from there, the hemorrhaging starts. The percentage of women in each subsequent cohort in the next grade up goes down until you get to the share of women in the very sort of highest echelons of the bank's management, that is the vice presidents and above. But that's a very, very small number of women. So in 2023, GJs who are vice presidents and above, GKs, vice presidents and managing directors, there were 39 GJs and 8 GKs. By contrast, GHs, which is the top sort of technical grade and the entry management grade, there was 1,619 positions, right? So for the bulk of individuals at the World Bank, management, or like the highest grade that they will attain, is GH. So we're really interested in that pipeline. And we see there that, the 2002 cohort is behind where it was when it gets to GG in 2012, is behind where it was even further in 2022. And the story is similar for the IMF, perhaps even worse in some ways, because there's no parity even at that entry grade, right? Only 40%, less than 40% of professionals entering in 2000 are women, and that doesn't really grow very much at all. Only about under 5% growth in this 20-year time period. At the IMF, starting from a lower base, there has been very robust growth in management ranks, but if you don't have the numbers of women that you're recruiting at the entry level, at some point you have to ask whether that growth is going to be sustainable at higher levels. One thing I want to note about the World Bank's data is that the growth in women's share of that feeder grade, which is GH, actually that feeder managerial grade, slowed from 2012 to 2020. So it was actually to 2022. So actually faster, more women became GHs from 2002 to 2012 than did from 2012 to 2022. And based on some other summary statistics that we've pulled up, we believe this is likely tied to an unintended consequence of the 2018 GH cap that the World Bank imposed sort of institutionally. And this sort of will segue to the next finding, which is about periods of change and how we must be extra careful then. But one last note that I want to make on this graph is that remember that these are all sort of pyramidal structures, right? So there are more GFs than GGs. You don't have a dearth of women to choose from when promoting, and you're still failing to promote at the same rate. And so I think this really motivates the need for the discussions we're going to be having today, especially the second panel, which is sort of in the thick of it right now, facing these challenges, and to try to understand what the bottlenecks are, why they're at every single stage, and what we can do as a community to really push this conversation forward. Okay, so as I said, we find periods of rapid change coinciding with backsliding on diversity. Now, this is looking across all cadres. This is not only in managerial grades. But on the left here are data from the EIB, where we see gender parity until a period of rapid change introduced a gap in 2014. And really kudos to the EIB's DEI office that told us about this. And they said this was on their radar, and they flagged it for us. But that gap has never closed. On the right here is from the IMF's contraction that followed the Great Recession of 2008, which is quite well known. Both the share of men and women in the IMF workforce does fall, and we knew that. The share of women in the workforce takes a greater hit, although in absolute numbers, there were far fewer women at the IMF at the time than men. And then men's recovery to their original pre-contraction levels was much faster. Those levels had recovered by 2012, within about 2 years of the contraction happening, while female employment levels took another 5 years until 2017. Here's the Jim Kim reorganization of the World Bank in 2013. And we see that even in management, that story holds. I do want to note for the IMF, what happened, a lot of what happened was admin staff took early retirement packages and left. So that's not necessarily sort of, from a welfare standpoint, good or bad. We don't have the data to say. But this, I think, is really concerning. So from 2005 to 2013, there was very steady growth in the share of women in senior management at the World Bank. That reorganization of 2013 reverses this trend. And since 2010, we're now 13 years out, there has been no net growth in the share of women in senior management. Uneven progress using data from the Asian Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. Both are banks that have that started out this period 2000 with a fairly small share of women in the workforce. There's lots of room to grow, but you'll see chunks of time, 4 or 5 years at a time, where there's very steady growth, but then in the middle there's nothing, with lots of room for improvement. And last but not the least, we looked at data for boards of directors and executive boards. And so on the left, we're comparing the World Bank as sort of the benchmark, which is that horizontal blue line, to IFIs and the OECD and WTO. And the World Bank is actually, even though only a third or less than a third of its board is female, they're actually sort of ahead of the pack. Comparable to the OECD, a little bit behind the WTO, but better than all the other IFIs. We also wanted to consider the World Bank's board against what might be considered some sort of comparators. So we're looking at, from mostly a small set of high and middle income countries, I do want to note, national averages of bank boards, central bank boards, corporate banks, legislative bodies, and then again in the lilac there, the IFI boards. And you'll find that compared to the IFI boards, as you see on the left, the World Bank does quite well. But compared to things like bank boards and even some legislative bodies, the World Bank is sort of definitely not leading. And the rest of the IFIs are lagging it further. So to the extent that we want the IFIs, as Masood said, these are aspirational in many ways, and we want the IFIs to be leading the conversation on representation and gender parity. That's certainly not what we're seeing here. So with that, I'm just going to, I think we have maybe time for one question if there is one, and I'll just see if there is one, but I'll leave this up here in the audience. Yes, please. Just please wait for a microphone to come to you.
I'm Barbara Bruns, who actually did work at the World Bank for 30 years. And I think the paradigm here is that all women professionals really aspire to this managerial progression. And I'm sure I'm not the only one for whom that wasn't true. I mean, I got promoted to division chief relatively early in my career. I hated it, and that would be the pathway to director and vice president. But I was very happy to stay at the professional level as a lead economist and have a chance to do research and more substantive work than, personnel management.
Yes, absolutely, and not everyone should be a manager, and we'll talk a little bit on the next panel about what makes a good manager and how we can foster institutional cultures that value managerial acumen above other aspects of qualifications, perhaps. This said, as you saw with the World Bank's data, the promotion to GH in itself, which is that position you're talking about, the lead, has a significant bottleneck. So without forcing women into, or anyone into managerial positions, I think it's important to recognize that for people to have fulfilling careers, we need to be addressing a bunch of different pinch points. Alan? Sure. Alan Gelb in the back row. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm Alan Gelb. I was also at the World Bank for a little while, more years than I should say. Thank you. This is tremendous. I have a question about the interaction between two types of diversity, that is gender and what we would call part one and part two. And I'm raising that because I remember several times when I was at the bank, and this issue came up, where it turned out that there was a pipeline, whether for recruitment or for promotion, but the issue was that the women, I was told they were American, and we have enough Americans, and so one should, this is what I experienced. So do you have any information on how the gender breakdown in these sort of ties in with that other issue about representation?
Yeah,
I'm thinking also on boards. For example, the comparisons that you've done have been against like bank boards, as I understand it, in rich countries. But it might look very different if you were comparing it to representation in other constituencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. So I should note here that I took over Alan's office when he retired from CGD, and every morning when I come in, I feel deeply unworthy of that space. So Alan, to your question about intersectionality, it's a really good one, and we will touch upon sort of qualitatively in both panels today. And this is something that, IFIs willing, I would love to explore further, and perhaps a next round of work is where the additional pinch points are. I mean, clearly, I'm here. You can see me. I'm a woman of color, and I'm an Indian citizen. My personal experiences and those of my friends and colleagues would certainly suggest that this is a very important dimension to investigate further, but not something that I have data to show you today. And on the comparison to national banks in low and middle income countries as opposed to high and middle income countries, I completely take your point. Can we hold this question? I will come to you when we open up the panel, but given that we have such a fantastic panel, I do want to invite everyone to come on to the stage. First, we have today Katrina Purefield. I apologize. I asked you how not to butcher your name, and then I did it anyway. Katrina Purefield, who is the director of the Human Resources Department at the International Monetary Fund. Katrina, please. You need to go over. Okay. Ana Bierde is the managing director of operations of the World Bank. Ana Maria Ibanez is the Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge at the Inter-American Development Bank. I think we're going to wait for a chair, but Mamta Murthy is the Vice President for Human Development at the World Bank. And last but not the least, Alexia Letortu is the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury for International Trade and Development. Thank you all so much for being here. By way of motivating this panel, I want to talk about an economist that all of us have been talking about a lot of late, but those of us who are women and labor economists have been admiring for a long time. Of course, I'm talking about Claudia Goldin. I couldn't start an event on gender today without referencing Claudia's work, right? So in a seminal paper with Cecilia Rouse, they show that when musicians do a blind audition for orchestra symphony positions, that is, they're performing behind a curtain, women are more likely to be hired by than men. But when the curtain is up and the person hiring can see who is being recruited, who's playing the music, then men are more likely to be hired. Achieving parity for promotion into managerial grades is difficult. The pool is small. The recruitment committee likely has a personal relationship with every applicant. And the audition, if you will, is a decades-long performance, right? It's reflecting endogenous choices based on systemic bias, on networks that are skewed, old boys clubs, on entrenched sexism, and so on and so forth. In other words, for managerial recruitment, the curtain is always up. And we see the effects of the curtain being up in these ways in the data that I just presented. So each remarkable woman on this panel has overcome staggering odds to rise to the top of her institution. They are powerful role models for all of us. And I also want to recognize the really remarkable ways in which they give back to the profession, to the other women in the profession. Whether it's Ana Maria recently leading a report on the status of women in the economics profession in Latin America and the Caribbean, bringing new data to the conversation. Ana placing a spotlight on women in leadership at the recently concluded annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. I have never seen so much gender-targeted and gender-aware Twitter messaging from any of the World Bank's accounts. So really kudos to you. Alexia representing a moving and powerful symbol of all that a Black woman can achieve, and engaging as a mentor now for a long time, both in the BRD, where she was actually a managing director, and now in the US government, mentoring women of color in specific. Mamta organizing, perhaps for the first time ever, a mentoring group for women in the World Bank's Human Development Vice Presidency. Mamta, I spent a long time in the World Bank, never had a woman that I directly reported to, and I would hear from your staff about the mentoring group, and I would feel such envy because I was not in the HDVPU. And Katrina, encouraging women in the Iranian bureaucracy to take on rigorous analysis and debate their findings with their male colleagues in a public forum. So these are incredible stories. These are powerful role models. And first and foremost, I do want to take a moment to celebrate them. But I also want to have an honest conversation today about what lies behind the trends that we have been looking at for the last few minutes and the staggering inequality, what I believe is staggering inequality that we see in the data. So the first question, before I ask you to sort of put your leadership hat on and talk about what ails these institutions, I'd like to invite you to reflect on your experiences as women, some of you as women of color, in the international development space and what the challenges were that you faced. And so the first question I wanted to ask you, all of you, is, looking back, what has been one salient challenge that you have faced in your career? A hurdle that, perhaps for a while you felt that you might not overcome, that you would be stuck there. And what got you over it? And Alexia, if you would open, that'd be great.
Thank you so much. And I just have to say, it's great to be in the house of Birdsall. Nancy, you're an inspiration to all of us. And I also have a thought for Rosalind Carter today, who is a trailblazer in her own right, and so in so many ways. So I was raised by parents who faced political persecution, who went into exile, who then who spent some time in segregated United States, and then raised a family in the 80s in Vienna, Austria, where there were very few Black people. And so my family always just said, get on with it. Persevere, get on with it. And so for a very long time, personally, I felt like I didn't really have challenges. I was in the solutions, just get on with it mode. And it's as I grew as a supervisor, a manager, and as a leader that on behalf of others, I became aware of a startling number of challenges. So I just wanted to say that up front. But then I started to think a bit more deeply about, okay, Alexia, what about yourself? And I think I'd like to talk about two things that I think have been some trends and moments that I still remember vividly. One was in a meeting, a management team meeting at Treasury, where I pushed back on something, which we're always invited to do. And my boss's boss shut me down in a really unusual way for the person, because the person was actually a great manager, very unusual, and also not proportionate to the conversation. I actually didn't understand it, but it stung me. It felt like a physical slap. And I had tears starting, and I'm like, don't be that woman who cries in front of her colleagues. And I really, and again, it's a small, all around a conference table, fairly small room, and I remember just trying to hold on to my composure, and I still remember this moment years later. Now, that manager recognized immediately and kept me, right when the meeting ended, stay behind and apologize. My boss, who was in the room, later on explained to me a little bit what was going on. But and I love this person, actually, the person who did this, but I feel that that person would have never spoken to one of the guys that way. And some of the guys push back regularly all the time in ways that are much more aggressive, I think, than I do. And I've never heard them get that response. And so one of the thoughts that I have in my head is, why are you sometimes treated differently than other people? And this is linked to the second story I wanted to share, which is, I think I am. I try to be a very institutional-minded person. I care about the institution. And there was a moment where I didn't get a promotion, which was fine. Actually, the person who got it was great. But I was told then by several board members, people thought you would stay. And so they thought, we can get this new great person. I was acting as the head of a place at the time. They're like, they know you. You're going to stay because you care about this place. You're not going to get huffed up. You're not going to be mad. So we thought we can have two great people. And one of the female board members said, this conversation happened indeed. And she said, wait, that's not a reason, to not give her the job if we think she is the right person. And so, again, I felt the person who got it was very qualified. I didn't have a problem with it. But that story stayed with me of, good team player, good institutional person, which are really important values to me. But does that sometimes play against you? Now, I would do the same thing again because I want to be happy with myself at the end of the day, but being aware of that is important.
And I think what you're describing here, is sort of different reactions, gendered reactions. I think it's so true and really, I think, resonates, I'm sure, with a lot of us in the room here. Thank you. Katrina.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Shani and all the team for the very provocative analysis. And Nancy, I think you had a great quote when I was going back reading some materials. More women speaking up and seizing the helm of power will create its own momentum. And I think if anything, Shani, your analysis shows more of us in each of our IFIs need to do that. And I thought deeply about your question, Shani. Was there one moment or not? No. I think it's evolving every single day. And it really changed as I had children and began raising a family, and how you had to keep striking and keep still striking that balance between work responsibilities and family responsibilities. And really, it can't be just the one mentor or the one moment or a target that's reached and then we forget about it. It has to be enshrined in each of our values, men and women. It has to be in our culture, in each of our institutions, and has to be backed by very clear HR policies and practices, accountability, and in every decision has to reflect that. When I think back on my career over 20-odd years, and I felt, I'm here in the presence of a lot of bank colleagues as well. I did have a little stint at the bank as well, and that will come in. As a young graduate, like what you just said, resonate. You came out of a PhD, you think the world's yours, everything's going to be fine. This bias doesn't exist anymore, there's no hurdles. But when I came to the fund many years ago, Very few women leaders, but those who I did come across and who were my division chiefs took the time to coach, took the time to sit down and guide me, no matter the role, and as I rose or took on different roles, what was expected of me, and then held my feet to the fire. So that would always give the best. But then I think it was later, as you became more senior, and that happened as I was becoming a young mother, it was the senior men in the fund, those who control positions, those who make decisions, that actually played a critical role, large and small. Some of it was support, high-level meetings being called really early things in the morning, just taking a moment outside the big meeting to say, should we move this next time, because this may not work for you, just that consideration. Or in the middle of the global financial crisis, or I should say just as it was starting, was a male leader in the European department who called me and said, we want you to contribute to that crisis response. But in making the offer to me, gave me options. Options that I could combine being in a mission chief role in the middle of a major crisis while being a mother with a 1-year-old who would not sleep, and gave me 3 or 4 options, and I've chosen the one that would maybe not be the one that I had to get off the plane into a press conference, but one that was going a little bit slower, and that allowed me to do it. Or it was when I had to follow my husband out to the field to South Africa, where I had no job, and how my colleagues at the fund kept in touch, my male colleagues. And Masood, it was you and Nassim when I came back, and you worked so hard with the Iranian authorities to convince them that I could be their first female mission chief, and they could accept me and get me back into the fund that way. So I'm really grateful for those opportunities and that support, and I think it made critical difference all the way along. Of course, in recent years, we're very fortunate to have female top leadership at the fund, and they also make decisions every day in hiring at the senior levels, and they've led by example by, I think in some of the more recent data, you'll see at the top of the fund in those 4 to 6 positions at the top, it is 50% women now, and that's partly reflecting the choice of leadership at the top. And they decide every day on these positions, and they've been leading by example. So I'll stop there, Ishani, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and certainly the challenges of caring for a child while juggling your own career resonate with many. This morning my son was grabbing my kurta as I was trying to leave the house, so very familiar. Let's see, Anna, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. No, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's such a great topic, and it's great to be with the panel. I was really intrigued by Alexia's opening of how she was sort of brought into this world and the circumstances that you're brought into this world. So I was born in Sweden. At the age of 3 to 4, 5 maybe, I joined the Swedish very national early childhood development program and learned from that moment that you have a lot of space in this world. There's a lot of equality in the country I grew up in, and I was never ever felt to believe there was something I couldn't do, which is why today I'm a huge advocate of early childhood development programs, and I realize I'm quite privileged to have been born into that setting with that sort of confidence boost from an early age that you're 50% of the world's population and you represent that, and the world's your oyster. So I do think it does shape us from an early start. That maybe is my first point. But reflecting back on your question, was there one sort of hurdle or a challenge? There's so many, and I'm listening again also to what my colleagues have said. When I look back at this long career at the bank, I came in young. First time I joined the bank was as a consultant funded by a Swedish trust fund. I was 22. I did very basic work. But I really got the bug that this is what I want to do. I got very good advice, which was leave because you're too young to be here. You need to get experience, So I left. I had done my studies, but I left to go work in the private sector, came back when I think I was 28. And I started my career, and it was in energy. All my colleagues were men, all my bosses were men, and they kept pushing me and saying, you can do more, you can do more. And I had one boss, actually an Iranian man, who also made me in charge of our Iran energy program, which was interesting. But he basically said, as long as we see capacity untapped in you, unused, we're going to keep pushing you up. And I didn't quite understand what it meant, but then up I went. And I have to say, getting up was not so hard as what you're describing when you're up. So whether it was becoming a manager and holding that space in my own right as a woman, becoming a director, holding that space as a woman, becoming a vice president, becoming a managing director, it is different to be a woman when you walk into the room. Let's just face it. You have to be assertive. But then maybe if you're assertive, you're not nice. Well, then you have to find your comfort. You go to bed at night feeling okay, yes or no. You have to be authentic. Is this you, yes or no? Because if you're not authentic, I don't think that you will be good, you can't do your job well, and you won't sleep well at night. So this is probably the struggle I think a lot of us face, which is we get there, and then once we're there, we find ourselves in this sometimes awkward space of, am I an equal in this room, yes or no? You know, I'm in a position now where I'm probably 10 years older than all the other younger, feel older sometimes, 10 years younger than every other managing director in the room, right? Because, you know, they're 10 years older than I am. So I'm also kind of reflecting, it's kind of an interesting place to be. So that's maybe one perspective. The other one, of course, is this issue of raising a family and having a career. And here, I don't think I did it necessarily right, because I have 3 sons, I worked all the way through. I'm guilty that I wasn't there for this, that, or the other. I do think when I get questions from women who say, how do you do it? What I find is that different phases of my life require different things. I'm now in a place where my boys are at college or working. So I have a lot more space for me, meaning I don't feel guilty when I come home at 8, or I don't feel guilty when I come home and get on the computer. But when they were younger, it was a constant tug of war, because you're guilty that you leave work early, you're guilty when you come home a bit late. I have to say, I had a Swedish nanny, I always tell this story, who was like, listen, I don't know about you, but I don't work these hours. If you want me, I do 40-hour weeks. That's how I grew up. And so I come, and you decide which 8 hours a day you want me. So I was like, oh my God, how do I deal with this? I need her early, I need her late. Anyhow, we settled on 5:30 p.m. And she said, you're going to thank me one day. I said, I feel like strangling you right now, and I might need to get a second person, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to have to be home at 5:30 during this period until my boys could sort of be alone for an hour, or my husband could, be there, and he also has a career. But I do thank her today, because frankly, nothing changed. I left at 5:15, drove home fast, and then I was home at 5:30. She left, and she actually would leave if I wasn't home. Leaving now, little text from her. I was like, oh, I gotta go. But nothing changed. I got home, I was with my kids, and then I got on the email. I didn't sleep that much those years, but nothing changed. So I think, your ecosystem is important, and being authentic is important. But is it challenging? Yes, every day it's challenging. And I think the biggest problem for me is I ask myself, was I me today? I was 90% me and 10% someone I think I have to be, because my ecosystem at work is like that. And I think that's something we always struggle with. But
yeah. Really good point on authenticity, and one I hope we can come back to, because I do think that's really important. Mamta.
So it's a very hard act to follow, all of you. I guess I grew up in India, and when you are a woman in South Asia, you grow up as a second-class citizen. There's just no other way of saying this. Actually, I'm not sure I would have said this 20 years ago, but I feel more confident in myself now, so I say these things. I guess the big advantage I had is a bit like Alexia. My parents were, they're no longer alive, 3 daughters and a son. They were very clear that we need to stand on our own feet. We need to get an education and stand on our own feet. Both my parents were feminists in that sense. My father more than my mother. He was the one who really pushed us to get an education and get a career. My mother was curious, was curiously powerful within the household. Even though she didn't earn an income, she basically was able to tell my father what to do. So they were an interesting combination, one of them being very assertive and one of them pushing us to get an education. I got my PhD in England in the late 80s, early 90s. And I think that was a different world for the economics profession than what I hear about today. where it's there are economics now has the reputation and backed by data of being a profession where it's actually very hard for women to get PhDs, and then they very hard to become tenured faculty. In fact, there are more women economists in industry and in the banking sector than there are in academia. But it was different at the time. And I certainly didn't feel, with my freshly minted PhD, and I'm a microeconometrician by training, I certainly didn't feel that people didn't take me seriously. That was not my experience. There was casual racism on the streets. There was, and this speaks to the intersectionality point that came up earlier. But I didn't feel it in the academic profession. When I came to the bank, it was different. At the bank, there were very few people in management positions in the mid-90s. When I came, you sat at the table and it was largely men. But that has changed, and 20 years, 25 years that I've been at the World Bank, there's been a massive change. To me, the biggest challenge was actually the work-life issue, managing the kids and the career. And in an environment which was dominated by men, I have to say that I had excellent bosses and mentors who really helped with the management of work-life balance. I remember a boss who said to me, you have to pick up your kids from daycare, it closes at 6:15. You need to indicate at the start of the meeting that you will leave at 6 o'clock, and then pass a note to the chair of the meeting at 5:59 and say that you're leaving. And I felt empowered to do that. I remember another boss, actually he was pretty influential in my career. I was expecting my second child, and then I thought, well, let me go and do something administrative because I don't want to travel. And a lot of women pay the penalty of stepping back when they have children. And he said to me, don't ever do that. Go work in research because you can do research and then you won't have to travel as much. And so I went to a chief economist's office and did research and reviewed other people's work. But that way I sort of didn't do an administrative role for which I think I would have paid a penalty. Little kids, we all go through it. They fall sick. I remember I was responsible for a seminar series in the chief economist's office, and every time we had an external speaker, I wouldn't be there because my kid was sick, right? And particularly if my husband was traveling, I would have to take the responsibility. So he had a great suggestion for me. He said, well, why don't you organize the seminar on days when your husband is in town, right? And just take that problem off the table, that you'll go through the effort of doing the organization and you won't be there. So I think at the end what I have to say is that I've been really helped by guides and mentors and people who've advised me. And I feel that that's something that I would like to do now, and that's why we have this this mentorship program in human development, so that people can share their experiences and learn from each other. Just in the way that I feel that I've learned from so many people around me. I do want to say that I think I very much relate to Anna's point about things being different at each stage of your career. I'm past the stage where I have little kids, but now the challenges are quite different, and the challenges have to do with being a woman of color. It also has to do with expectations people may have about how you might conduct yourself. And that's the one that I really try hard to dispel, because I am quite feisty. I do stand up for the things that I believe in. People tell me that I have the ability to say truth to power. I don't know what that means exactly, but it's very easy when you're in that category to be regarded as somebody who's a troublemaker, who's somebody that is difficult to have around, and that's their expectation, and not one that I think I should subscribe to.
Absolutely. People are responsible for their own expectations. Ana Maria.
Thank you, Shani. And first, I would like to congratulate you and your colleagues for the report. I think it's very important to have this done by CGDEF in a very good and very rigorous way, and to have the data there. It makes us have difficult conversations at the IFIs, and that's important. And also to Nancy, I mean, she left a very important mark at the IDB, so I'm really glad to be here. I think many of us have said similar things, so I'm going to repeat myself a little bit. But yes, I was born in Colombia, and I do feel that the moments where being a woman have been more difficult for me was balancing my working life. I was divorced when my second daughter was 3 years old, so I did it on my own, a little bit. And I have many instances when I decided to take care of my kids and not do professional things, papers that I didn't write, conferences that I didn't go to, opportunities that I didn't take because I didn't have really the chance to make a decision. So I do believe that the personal life is very important as well. Choosing well your partner is very important. It's a very important matter. But also the norms and the regulations in the countries to help women are very important. And I think that's something that we as women in EFIs need to push for. So that's something that I do believe it's important. When I was a professor at Universidad de los Andes, I was there 16 years old, the 16 years, and I was the dean of the School of Economics. I didn't really feel constrained by being a woman. We were not many women. It's like 16% of the school were women, but many of us were in position of power. So when I arrived as dean, I appointed all were women. So we were all women in the School of Economics, most of us. And I think that's important because that creates, again, the regulations for helping women in the workplace. And also for sending very important messages to men, saying to them that they are responsible as well for childcare. For example, creating licenses for men that they need to take, that Sweden has done very important things on that respect. But when it was very interesting, when I was at the department at the School of Economics, I was 43 years old and I was the oldest woman in the department. So that shows how much we have progressed through time. But I really felt that being a woman constrained me more here when I arrived to the US, not in Colombia. First, when I went to the universities, I went to being a visiting professor at 2 universities at the US. And this intersectionality of being a woman, a Latin American, doing research on conflict and violence and having an accent, well, that was very difficult. So I had to work much more than many of the people that were around me and prove my worth much more. And that creates a lot of anxiety, and I think that reduces our productivity as well. But I also have found in many respects that men have been very important for me, and they have been mentors and have believed in me. They are the ones who have appointed me to high positions that I have been able to take advantage, not only for my professional advancement, but for helping other women advance while they are in their professional lives. But in these international institutions, you do feel that you have to be much more assertive, that you have to think in the meetings, not only technically what you are going to say, but how you're going to behave, how you're going to say it, how you're going to move, how you're going to look each of your colleagues during the meeting, and that makes it very difficult to really perform. I have just an anecdote, and I finish. When I arrived to the Inter-American Development Bank, we arrived to a meeting, and there were a lot of men, and the previous vice president, who was a woman as well, was there. She was my boss. And when they arrived, I am Colombian, we are like that, and I said, do you want a coffee? And my boss seated me down and said, never offer a coffee to anybody, because then you will be tagged as a person that is serving other people, and so you should be very careful. So you are all the time, every second, thinking, how do you need to behave in order to be respected? And I think that's something that is very difficult to do things.
And I think it goes back to Anna's point about authenticity and the toll it takes on you if you feel like you can't be who you are. If your nature is to offer someone coffee, you should be able to do that without facing a professional penalty. Listening to all of you and the different stories that you shared, first of all, thanks for the honesty. I think a lot of this to the women in the room is familiar. But I also wanted to hear these stories and put them up on this stage because I think often men don't hear them. And I think they're taken by surprise sometimes. And so I think to the extent that male allyship is important, and all of you have in different ways highlighted that. I think it's important to be sort of open about the conversations we have among us, ourselves, and have these conversations more publicly. But also looking at the different challenges and the strategies that you've described that you overcame at various points. I'm reminded of the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. I don't know about a child, but it certainly takes a village both at home and in the professional sphere to support a woman. And so we need a lot of different strategies. Alexia, I have you here. I have to ask you this question. So now moving on to sort of the more institutional role. We understand that you don't represent the US government, but in the 20 years, speak for the US government. In the 20 years that are in our data for the World Bank, there have been 6 presidents, 3 nominated by Democrats. You know where this is going. All of them have been men.
When the way you said Alexia, I knew trouble was coming.
So, what characteristics is the U.S. looking in a World Bank for in a World Bank president, and why can't it seem to find a woman that meets these criteria?
Thank you for that question. I'll get to it, but I want to start out. I want to start out by saying that I work in a Treasury Department headed by Secretary Janet Yellen, who, as you know, is famous for all the firsts that she collects. First chair of the Federal Board, first chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and of course, first female Secretary Treasury. And she carries those firsts with both incredible confidence and lightness, which I think is really important to me. And when I travel with her, it is just stunning to see the number of women, but sometimes men as well, who just come to her, and sometimes it could be the most junior person in the room, saying, but I've followed your work, I've read your work, can I please have a picture with you? The inspiration that she inspires to so many people around the world, including to myself. So I wanted to start with a bit of an homage to Janet Yellen, who's extraordinary as a professional and as a human. And the way she treats staff and the way she remembers and thanks staff. So there's also a style issue in terms of her brains, but also her style, which is palpably different than other secretaries of the Treasury. Secondly, I want to say that the Biden-Harris administration, coming out of the gate in terms of board representation, you talked about politically appointed roles, had a female ED at the World Bank, a female ED at the African Development Bank, a female first openly lesbian woman of color at the Asian Development Bank, an alt-ED woman at the Inter-American Development Bank, and a female nominee to be the ED at the IMF. So hopefully that says something. Your data on politically appointed positions did not surprise me. And here I want to talk about recruiting processes that are more linked to word of mouth, who knows who, than incredibly rigorous, qualification-based, real panel-based interviewing processes. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see not just that political appointed positions are far behind. In some ways, I feel like the race hasn't even started with them, frankly. We're not even let go. Because a lot of the way it works is people sit around a room, oftentimes for reasons that you've described, the people are mostly male, and they say, who do we know could be good? And shocking, the first people that come to mind are people in their close network and people who therefore look like them. And so I think the issue, something that I think Nancy, you've done, I think of Jane Piercy, who was a former World Bank ED, who's a true connector, is I advise everybody to start, young in your career, a list of people that you meet that you find incredible, and to keep track of them as they grow in their career. And literally, I have this list, so then when a senior position comes up, I can go back, and it's not just who I remember that day, or but I was at dinner last night, we were trying to think of names for positions, and it's hard sometimes. In the moment, when you need to come with your short list, you don't always remember, so you can go back and go, hey, I remember this person impressed me. It can be 10 years later, where are they now? Let me see. Are they still? It really is important to have that informal network ready, because that is the way the politically appointed processes work. The second thing I would say is I would love for them to work in a slightly more systematic way. So this is the second political job that I have. The first time I went to interview for a political job, prepared as I usually do, all this thing, walked in, I barely got asked a question. It was like super informal. Like I had to ask all questions because I got asked, there was an assumption that I was good because I had been recommended by someone. And so I was like, was that an interview? What was that? It was so strange. And I think that's also, you know, if you can bring more rigor into the process, I think you would get more diverse outcomes. So it's not about the characteristics that women don't have. I think it's more about the process. Mm-hmm. The last thing I will say, and I said this publicly to the Financial Times, as a woman, as a Black woman, and as a woman who worked very hard on the World Bank president campaign, I'm very proud of Ajay Banga's nomination. He is someone who is not only of Indian origin, was not only born in India, but grew up in India and started his professional career in India. And so for me, when I think about who the US proposes for that, to be a candidate for the World Bank president, to have someone like him be our candidate for an international development position, I'm incredibly proud of showing this is the kind of person the US can stand up. So I am unapologetic about that. Do I want to see a female World Bank president? Do I want to see a female Asian Development Bank president? Absolutely. But I'm also unapologetic about Ajay Banga.
Absolutely. And you know, and as you said, he's the first to have been born and raised in a low-income country, to have been entirely educated in one. And I think that is an important point to make. Anna, you know, is parity, gender parity, a goal for the World Bank in management? Should it be a goal? You know, the stats are not great. 40% of senior management positions held by women, but no growth since 2010. The vast majority of management positions, which are at that GH level, you know, maybe a third of them are held by women. Again, that's slowing growth towards parity in that grade. Do these stats represent a fair and equitable system of promotion? And reflecting on your own experiences, you know, both as a longtime bank staffer and now it's MD, what can the World Bank do to fail to overcome these pinch points that it's been up against for a while?
Yeah. So the number I have of management, which of course is from GH management and above for the World Bank, is at about 45% now. Now, different levels have different populations. So the manager, GH, is the biggest pool, if you will. And then the director is a bit smaller, but still pretty big. Vice president, not so big. And then, of course, managing director, quite few. So my first point would be when you're at the smaller pool and a couple of people fall out, it's really easy to slip back down very quickly. I think the biggest problem we have, so we have actually increased steadily, sometimes not at the pace we want to be, and then we have some setbacks, we get back at it. Is it important? Absolutely. You know, again, throughout my career, I have always asked myself, are quotas the way to go? Is this the way we want to do it? And I have always wished, no, we shouldn't be there, but it's useful until we're there. So I think this 50%, the parity is very important, and I think we need to keep it. One issue watching your slides that I wrote down to myself is, I wonder if 50% is a problem for us, because once we get towards it, maybe we think the job is almost done. And then you start getting a bit complacent, or the sense of urgency is not as strong. So I wonder if, you know, you don't have to put it at 75 or 100, although my office is practically 90 maybe, but that's also actually not great, because I actually believe in balance for reasons I'll come back to. But I do think, anyhow, it's a thing I will go back and look at. But what is the biggest problem for us? I think it's two things. One is we don't have a rigorous process for pipelines. So when I look now, for example, I'm responsible now for looking, of course, at the vice presidents. And I look at our pool of directors who could be promoted into vice presidents. I don't have a great talent pipeline according to the system we use. I just don't think that we're very strong at this. I look then at the managers and say, we need to start grooming people earlier. I find I don't have a very diverse pipeline. So I may have the gender parity, but now all of a sudden I don't have, I think someone was raising earlier, the diversity. So then that bothers me a bit, and I'll share this. We have very few Asian managers, East Asian managers in the bank. That's a pipeline we don't have. We don't have that many Americans in senior positions anymore in the bank. That's very different from, let's say, 20 years ago. So this issue of diversity is also important. But I think we need to focus on pipelines. I think we need to focus early on, and we need to really, and I like this idea of keeping track of people, following people, nurturing people. So I think that's one. The second thing is, I find it very interesting to listen to the stories because everyone brings up work-life balance. And Mamta's story of her one manager saying, don't do that, stay, but do something different. I talked to a lot of women, and I was in the position myself of, you get to the G level in the bank, and you're sort of like, this is where I plateau off because I'm going to get married and I'm having my kids, and I'm happy now. This is it. And I keep telling people, that's okay for now, but don't plateau out there. But we do see more women in GG than we see in GH. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a problem. When I look at some of the pipelines for GG to GH promotions, technically, some of our sectors have very, very thin pipelines, almost none, no women. And I wonder to myself, why is it? Is it because people sort of said, this is where I plateau off? Is it because we didn't nurture? Is it because some professions, be it energy or economics, was not seen to be gender friendly or gender promoting? So I think we also need to look at different grade levels and see what does it take to nurture a pipeline in that grade level. So I think we're getting better. We're not there yet. In my MOUs with vice presidents, I have said gender parity for me is absolutely essential. And I want to measure it at two places. Do you have parity in your management team, yes or no? So that would be for vice presidents at the manager and director level. And do you have it at the professional level, GF plus, up to manager? And some are doing quite well. Some are good on one, not the other. There's one region that is doing poorly on both. And I said, this has to now be the focus. I don't want to see a short list that doesn't have women in it. I just don't want to see a short list. And if it comes to me with no women, I will push it back. And I hope that you will do the same, I say, to the vice president reports to me if it's a short list that doesn't come to me for my approval. We have to look broader and we have to look wider. I also believe in taking a bet on people. I appointed, when I was in ECA, 2 women who actually went from G to manager, which meant they got an H and a managerial position in the one go. They were the ones saying, please don't do this to me. I said, I know you can do it, because you have that capacity, someone told me once I had. I know you can do it, but we will support you. And the first year was rough. Rough because you're also dealing with perceptions of your peers. Why did you get this job? You went from G to H to manager. You have to support, and then you have to really help the person earn that space, and that's not so easy. That's not so easy, but I made sure we put people around them, the 2 of them, and they are doing very, very well today. Very, very well today, so.
I think the point of support when you do push people, I think is really important, and thanks for making that point. You raised a couple of things that we're gonna come to. So the first is that of the short list, and I do want to talk about recruitment, and then with Mamta, I'd love to ask about the HD talent boards, because coaching and mentoring and the pipeline and developing that has come up repeatedly at this point in your personal experiences. But Katrina, so, you know, it's very clear that IFIs have very progressive institutional goals about diversity, equity, and inclusion, at least on paper. With very good reason also, recruitment at IFIs is often decentralized individual recruitment panels. And this is, again, on paper good, because, you know, then managers recruited this way aren't accused of being there because they are meeting some other criteria. And nobody wants to hear that, right? You want to believe, and it is true that we are promoted because we have the high technical quality, not because we look a certain way. But in practice, what that means with these decentralized recruitment panels is that that decision making is often based on networks and old boys clubs, all the way to the very top. So on the other hand, if HR takes a more centralized approach, then you have people questioning and undermining the folks that get there using that more centralized approach. It's a difficult balance, and as much as I apologize to Alexia for lobbing a tough question, I also apologize to you because I don't know that there's a perfect answer, but as the head of the IMF's HR, how do you think about that balance between progressive institutional goals and a more hands-on role for HR versus recruitment panels that are sort of a free-for-all?
Can I first say, I hear you. And every single day I face that. Excuse after excuse, I'll be frank, that my role is different or my department's different and needs this specialist technical skill. And in a world of thousands and thousands of econ or IT graduates, we can't find a woman or an underrepresented person? Really? Really? So it's a constant struggle. But if we don't get the technical expertise, we've lost the battle to begin with. So let me share, I want to talk about the recruitment, but if you permit me, also the promotion, because I think Andrew earlier raised an important issue, and I want to share some information that we've done there, because we did run a few regressions on that, and I want to share that with you. But on the recruitment, and especially because it goes to this point, economics only produces 25 to 30% PhD female graduates each year, especially in the US, but also as I go around the world recruiting, I also see that pipeline there. But it is a big pool. So at the fund, we do have we're hiring currently about 250 people a year because we're growing. And we're going backwards as we grow. So that's your point in your paper really resonated. But when we recruit, half of our recruitment is for economist positions, just over half. And there we do have centralized recruiting, about 2 big flagship centralized programs, the flagship economist program for those PhD graduates, and the mid-career program for economists with policy-making experience that don't have PhDs. They account for 60% of our economist hiring. The rest is the specialists, be it the new climate specialists, the new digital money, or the financial sector experts, and they're done individually. Case by case, department by department. Let's compare the two. And it's not always been like this, and it's been constant work to get here. When we have the centralized panels and the centralized process, there is a big difference in the recruitment process. I look at the outcome, what happens. I look at our economist program. Over the last 3 years, we've been able to find 50 to 55% of our new hires in that program as women. And it took deliberate effort. I think three key things. One is HR, with our departments, with our res reps in the field, went out and we sourced and tried to find these wide pools. I think that was the first thing. So it took deliberate effort. I've gone and sent my team out all around the world to look for them. So it costs money, it takes time. It takes a lot of time. I think the second thing we did is actually in this, I think that really, the point you made about rigorous recruitment processes, so you don't rely on that network, the amount of steps you have to go through to get through that program, the panel interviews, the screening interviews, the psychometric testing, the presentations that you have to do, the written tests you have to do. We have diverse panels in each of them, and then the committee itself that oversees, vets, and approves these is 60% women, 30% from underrepresented regions. And I think that's important, because if we move to centralized, so HR doesn't get that you're not giving us the people we need, they need to know their peers have selected these people through this rigorous process so they can trust the hiring from those centralized panels. And I will say that setting the ambitious goals do help, because every manager then is aware we're not getting there. So the panels and the committees go in and they say, we haven't made the target, or what are we doing? Let's look again. And we try to make sure there's a broad enough pool to be choosing from so that we can get that 50 to 55%. It's not enough. It's only happened in the last 2 or 3 years. So we do have the pipeline issue too. And let me turn to, I think, that very important question earlier on promotions. Because I think, as you all say, we'll only just keep chipping at the glass ceiling. We won't shatter it, because I think most of us hire from within into our managerial positions. So we don't have those pipelines. or we're going to go backwards, and I'm actually seeing that now at our entry-level managerial grades at the fund. But we're economists, and I'll only convince my colleagues with econometrics and data. And I teamed with the best econometricians in the fund to do this. Did our targets and did the policy changes we make from 2016 onwards under Lagarde and under Kristalina make a difference? We set more ambitious targets. We made the shortlisting process have to have either a woman or an underrepresented person in it. The panels had to have that too. Did it make a difference to our promotion rates? So with research, because nobody would believe it if my economists in HR did it, so we paired with research and we got the data and we ran the regressions. And if we look at the difference before and after the implementation of those policies, the promotion rates for women rose to 15% from 7%, so doubled. But for URR women, that's our jargon for underrepresented regions, it went from 6 to 7%, so very little difference. And now you'll all say, oh, but you didn't control for, well, we did, tenure, your performance ratings, your mobility across the fund. And we did, when we put in those controls, did find for non-diverse women, it did lift the promotion rate by 9 percentage points, but we still have a problem for underrepresented women. So I think we're sharing this now. We're going through sharing this at the fund. We're going to present it to our board. I think we have work to do there at that intersectionality, and we have work to do, and I will take it on with Mara, our diversity advisor this week, at our committees that oversee that entry-level promotions. Why is it in the last year that only 20% of the nominees, the selections have been women or URR every single month? And do we need to do something more? Because we've done all of this, and now they're still coming with only 20%. And I look at that pipeline because of the pyramid, we have more than ample amount of women and diverse there. So why aren't they getting the opportunities that they're not comfortable to be selected for that position? And that's a difficult conversation we're going to have in the coming weeks.
Thank you. You said many things that resonated. One thing that I thought was really telling was how you felt you had to lean on the research economists, because if HR had presented these numbers, they'd be sort of viewed as a nuisance. And so I want to come back to the issue of sort of institutional culture and how we make it a more inclusive one. But just on these issues that, Anna, you highlighted, on pipeline building, Mamta, again, I've heard so much appreciation, and as I said, I've experienced personal envy about the mentorship that you have put together for the women of the Human Development Vice Presidency. But I want to ask you about the talent board. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, the World Bank's talent boards are this sort of oft-elusive group within each bank sector that is responsible for ensuring strong talent pipelines, and clearly, importantly, the promotion to GH. So for Mamta, for the education, health, and social protection talent boards, which fall under your purview, is gender parity part of what they aim for, and how does it come into sort of play for that, identifying that pipeline and building it?
So we have a very large number of women who work in these sectors. We are more than 50% women. So the talent boards, if they are promoting people at a similar rate, both genders, we should be seeing a reflection in management of more than 50% women. The interesting thing is that in 2 of the groups, we are at more than 50% of managers being female. And we have very good geographical representation. But we're not in that position in the 3rd group. So the question that I ask is, why is it that we can do it in 2 of the groups and not in the 3rd group? And what is the learning that can happen? And that's something that is happening at the moment. Now, the talent boards have the responsibility, and I think this is how they strike the balance between centralized and decentralized. They have the responsibility for preparing the shortlists. And we don't have shortlists which are not equal in terms of gender and have good geographical representation. You can't get complete all the regions for pipeline issues, but also because we want to keep the shortlists short. right? But we're not in a situation where we have shortlists which are less than 50% female. And the talent boards play a very important role in that. The other thing that they do is that they look at promotions and they do a statistical breakdown. Who are we promoting? Is it the case that we are promoting people who are in visible roles as opposed to people who are in non-visible roles? I talked about the penalty that many women pay when they are doing non-visible roles because they want to manage having young children at home. So we look at things like that. Who are we promoting? What kinds of roles are they performing? What nationalities do they have? And I think that's a way of doing a second check on what's going on. It's not perfect, but I think it's a part of the rigor that we need to have. Finally, I would say that a lot of what also needs to happen is just having better information. And this goes to the informal part of the thing that happens. Just having better information about who's out there and what they're doing. Because the absence of that information can even affect a rigorous process. Yeah. Because there are implicit things, they're explicit things, but they're implicit ones. And not having good information about who's out there and how they're performing. At this point of time, we have a lot of staff who are decentralized. Our talent boards sit here in Washington, D.C. So you don't know how well somebody is doing in a very difficult program in Indonesia or in Burkina. But the talent board needs to know that. So having that information flow within the institution is very important for the promotion process. Finally, just to say a word about the Women in Human Development group that we've started. It's a safe space for everyone. It's for men and women. And people come and talk about their experiences and they share challenges that they face, but also solutions that they found. We have a very active Yammer group. I didn't know this thing called Yammer existed, but we have a very active Yammer group where people post questions. There are answers that are provided. They share information, tips, and so on. And I think that's another thing that has been very helpful in both socializing and sensitizing a wider group of people on what are the challenges faced by women, faced by people of color, but also providing solutions, right? So that people can learn from each other.
Thank you. And we will open it up for audience Q&A, but I do want to end with a question for Ana Maria. You know, the IDB has made a lot of progress towards parity gender parity in the last 10 to 15 years, with the share of women in country leadership in particular more than doubling in the last 5 years, is what I've been told. But in interviews that I've done with women at the IDB, one thing that comes up over and over again is one of a struggle between, again, these very progressive institutional goals and priorities for inclusion and equity, and a culture that it still has prejudice and, as one person described it, micro-machoism entrenched in it. And so how do you think about your role in leading cultural change? Easy question to end.
It's a very, very easy question and very important. No, but let me talk a little bit about how we help women progress and get promoted, because I think it's very important to have this very rigorous process that you are all describing, but we need to help women get ready to be promoted as well, and that's very important. And I want to give an example of what I'm seeing at the IDB. When you look, we started to look into who were the team leaders of the projects, because we started to arrive to the board, and suddenly, I was the vice president sitting behind all men, describing the project and defending the project and presenting the project. So I asked for data, and we started to look into how many team leaders we had that were women, which percentage. It's lower than 50%. And so we started doing econometrics as well. So it was, is it because once they arrive to the team leader, the possibility of being team leaders, there are not enough women? No, it was not because of that. Is it because they have less experience, they have been less at the bank? No, it's not because of that. Is it because they have less education? No, it's not because of that. And we did the regressions to control for all of that. I mean, of course, we are just exploring it, but what we see is that women are appointed less as team leaders. Mm-hmm. And so if we don't prepare them to be promoted as well, even though we have rigorous processes, they are not going to be promoted. So I just wanted to give that anecdote because I was really struck by the data. And the data showed very clearly that women were not being appointed as team leaders. I showed it to the sector managers, almost all are men. And we had a very interesting conversation on why did that happen. And we need to put in place formal programs to help women be team leaders. For example, traveling. It's very important. If you're a team leader, you have to go to the country. But if you have a small child, it's going to be difficult. How do we support women to go and go traveling in order to be a team leader? All those type of things are very important as well. So just a small anecdote. And on the culture, yes, and that's a very important question, because what we see often in these institutions is that cultural changes are oftentimes much slower than the norms, the regulations, and the formal programs that we put in place to help women, to help other diverse groups. So we need to have cultural changes, and for that I do believe that a woman leader or a man leader as well can make a difference and can help gradually change the culture. Let me give you some examples for leading by example. I do believe that leading by example is very important. For women, that is very important. And so I mentioned at the beginning in the first question that I'm fully aware that my behavior, my decisions, the way I behave during meetings, how I make decisions is very important. And it's not only very important for the vice presidency to work, but to send messages and to show that we women are able to make good decisions, that we women are competent, that we women are good at promoting other women, but at promoting other diverse groups as well, and striking, for example, regional balances in the places that we work. And I have found that this is very important every day that I go to work, but particularly so in some meetings, where you can feel that interplay between prejudices and culture, and that is very difficult. When you see man interrupting woman, where you see man believing that the woman is not able to make decisions, and the man is explaining to the woman what decision it should do, which it happens a lot, especially when you are just arrived to the vice presidency. And not trusting the technical capacity of the woman or the capacity of the woman to stand for the things that she believes is important for the vice presidency. So leading by example, I think, is very important. And showing that women are worth it and that women are competent is very important. So that's something that we should do, leading by example. The second is modeling work-life balance, and I really like the first part of our panel, because what is important is that we need to prioritize that is important for our welfare and for the satisfaction that we have in our job, and we have to protect it. But it's not easy, and it's very important for us to say that we are struggling with it. That's something that is very important that we as women leaders have to do. But also I think it's important to promote cultural changes around it, to say to men that they are part of the equation, so that they have to help, for example, their wives, and tell them, it's 6, you have to go to pick up your kid, and the childcare. Those things are very important as well, and to promote formal programs for that. And I do give a lot of priority for that. I'm really publicly vocal saying that work-life balance is important, and protecting the time of my staff, so they do go and take care of what they need to do. The third thing that I think is important is to showing commitment to what we're talking about, not only through HR policies, but we are at the IFI institution, so we have to promote this discussion at the country levels. So recently we created, for example, I pushed for doing a workshop on race and diversity in our countries, which is a huge issue. Gender diversity is very difficult, but race and ethnicity is much more difficult. So we created a seminar, we brought researchers from the region, and we started talking about it. And so that's important as well, and I do think that promoting that in our countries is important. And the fourth one is through mentoring and through networks. I do believe that's very important. And I do believe that is very powerful when we as women get together and help each other in a formal way. such as what Manta was describing. We have also a group at the IDB that is called In IDB We Connect that we created. It's a woman economist group that was inspired by WILAC, that is another woman economist group in La CEA, that was led by Raquel Fernandez. And this group is great. What we do is basically that we have launches every other month where women, especially junior women, we promote that is the junior ones, not the senior ones, presents their work in progress mostly, operational research, and we provide comments. And we create a safe space for providing comments. This also has been very important for us to get to know each other, to do the senior list that we need to do, to see very young women that we say, okay, we need to push this woman forward and help her to become a team leader, and then she will become a division chief, and hopefully she will become a vice president. So those 4 things I think are very important to try to change a little bit the culture of the institution, but it's a slow process. And men play a very important role, so we need to bring men to the table.
Yeah, and I think we had a great example this morning, to be a little self-serving here. But you know, I think we should all, but men in particular, I think it would help us for folks to be unapologetic about calls for diversity. I was really surprised and encouraged to hear several of you talk about quotas, for instance, explicitly using that word up here, you know, that is often sort of treated like it's a 4-letter word, and it's not. You know, every CGD panel I've been to, I've always thought to myself, why do they not schedule more time for audience Q&A? And here we are with 2 minutes left. I see lots of hands. What we're going to do is collect questions. We are not going to have time to answer them. I am apologetic for that. We do have another fantastic panel that'll come on about 10 minutes after this one that'll add color to a lot of things that we've touched upon, things like decentralization that we didn't really go into, intersectionality, authenticity, coaching. We're going to hear about a couple of really great examples of coaching and mentorship for women, the impact of travel on young mothers. So stick around for that. With my sincere apologies, I think we're going to wrap this here. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panel.
Good morning, everyone. If you can please come and join us and take your seats for this second panel discussion. It's a real pleasure to be here today as the moderator of this panel. My name is Art Cray. I am the Chief Economist of the Equitable Growth Finance and Institutions Practice Group at the World Bank. We have a great panel here today, and I'll just take a moment to introduce our panelists before we turn to the questions and answers part of the panel. So immediately to my left, we have Alaka Holla, who is a senior economist at the World Bank, who leads the World Bank Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund. This multi-donor trust fund advances policy decisions in education, health, water, and sanitation. And Alaka is also an accomplished researcher with a great deal of experience in implementing randomized controlled trials on a range of interesting topics. Alaka joined the World Bank as a young professional and is currently working in the Office of the Chief Economist for the Human Development Practice Group. Then beside Alaka, we have Adana Chukwuma, who's the Senior Director for Global Impact Management at Visa, where she drives alignment between digital payment growth and social impact using data science and strategy. Prior to this, she was a colleague at the World Bank, although this is, I think, the first time that we meet, so it's nice to meet you, where she advised policymakers, ministers of health, and ministers of finance, having joined as a young professional in 2016. Next to her, we have Florencio Lopez-Bo. She is a lead economist in the IDB's Social Protection and Health Division, where she works on child development and poverty reduction projects. Previously, she was a professor at the University of Louvain and has worked at the World Bank and at UNIDO as well. And then finally, on my extreme left, we have Bernice van Bronckhorst. She's the Global Director for Urban Resilience and Land Global Practice at the World Bank. She joined the bank in 2005 as an urban specialist in the Latin American Caribbean region. She's had a number of positions since then with increasing levels of managerial responsibility as well. And it's great to have you to bring that perspective to the panel. So I'd like to just open the discussion with one or two observations on the presentation that we had from Ishani first thing this morning. And I wanted to first just congratulate Ishani and her colleagues on this very informative and excellent research. I think one of the things that we heard also from a couple of the previous panelists is the power of data to change minds, at least minds that are, housed in economists' bodies, because we tend to, not respond to persuasion in other forms. And in fact, one of the things that I just wanted to put as a question and as a plug for more research along these lines, because I think Ishani would be the first to acknowledge the limitations of the data that she had access to, where you simply have, one crosstab of grade by gender. Over time, there's only so much you can do relative to what you could do with, say, having access to panel data that allows you to track individuals over time and answer a lot more interesting questions. And so I'm not sure who exactly I'm speaking to here, but I would certainly encourage all of the HR departments at the institutions that you've worked with to figure out how we can do more, right? Do more with access to record level HR data. This is not a heavy lift when you think about it. I mean, in all of our institutions, we have researchers who regularly work with highly confidential whether it's tax return level data or HR level data or other data from our client countries. And we have protocols, we have ways for doing so in safe settings that respect the confidentiality of the data, yet allow much richer conclusions to be drawn from it. So, and having collaborated, I'll say, with Ishani in just extracting the simple crosstabs from the World Bank colleagues, I'd certainly hope that that we can easily sort of go the next step to enable a lot richer data. And again, this is also not unprecedented even for World Bank HR data, where we have, within the last 10 years, had a very practical collaboration between researchers in the World Bank who are granted access to the HR microdata to do a study on behalf of HR on gender pay inequities at the World Bank. There's no reason why we can't be doing this, I would hope, with all the institutions that you've been successful in connecting with, Ishani, and definitely wanted to open with that sort of call for better research. and better data, which then helps to change minds. All right, so having observed the previous panel and realizing how quickly time passes by, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with one question for all of you. Again, that's actually kind of similar with how Ishani started with the previous panel. And then we'll see if we can do, we have 2 other rounds planned, but maybe we'll compress them into one, and I'll just ask you both questions at once. So the question for all of you is, where would you like to see your career go in the next 10 years or whatever your relevant planning horizon is, which is different for people at different ages and points in their career? And what is the biggest challenge that you would see facing you as a woman in getting to that point? And what is one change that you would like to see either your colleagues or the institution make that would help to overcome those challenges? So if it's okay, we'll begin with Alaka.
Thank you, Art, and thanks, Ishani and everyone for the invitation to speak on this panel. So if you ask me, I'm going to answer this in 2 different ways. First is just a substantive way. What kind of work do I want to do that makes me feel good about getting up in the morning and going to work? And that would be applying my skills. I'm kind of a researcher by nature. I like the scientific method. So applying my skills to kind of to answer a question that a country is facing that's getting in the way of progress, mostly on human development issues. And so if I look to kind of what would be my accomplishment that I've kind of experienced so far at the bank, that's a little like my parents were both doctors in a small town, and they could see their patients in front of them, that they've helped, and can really see, oh, I've helped this person. For me, that would be helping a country over a 2-year period through a very difficult reform. It was informed by data, so that when I was pressing the case, you really should do this, I had a ton of analysis to back what I was saying. The client understood and believed the analysis, and so they understood that when they were making these difficult decisions in the hospital sector, it was backed by data, and we knew with almost certainty that we were going to lead to a Pareto improvement. And that was a Pareto improvement that was affecting millions of people, right? And so this is kind of why I wanted to work at the World Bank. I didn't, even though I'm analytical by nature, getting a paper accepted in the American Economic Review, it's nice, but it really doesn't, get me excited about going to work. And so I would really, if you ask me what is my goal, for the next part of my career, I would really like to replicate experiences like I had when I really know I'm using my skills to make a difference. Now, if you go into the world that Ishani, was presenting about, about grade levels, I am a GG economist. There is this, like Barbara mentioned, I don't want to manage people. I want to continue using my analytical skills. So my aim would be an H-level economist. Now, how likely do I think that is to happen, right? And so now I'm going to bring research to answer this question. So if you think about another study that Claudia Golden did on MBAs and when does the wage gap start to occur, it's when they have children, right? And it affects professions that MBAs would go to more than, say, professions that a doctor would go to, because in professions like MBAs go to and like our profession, there's a lot of kind of face time that you have to put in. You can't just do a good analysis. You have to kind of go on a PR campaign about your analysis. You have to talk to the right people, at the happy hour. You have to make people not feel threatened by you when you disagree with them. And so that takes a lot of time and bandwidth, right? And that's some of that time and bandwidth I would really like to give to my kids, or to my dad, or to my family, the rest of my family. And so when I see, what it's going to take to go to a very rationed position, like an H-level position, do I have the bandwidth and time to kind of put in that extra thing that I was not trained to do? Maybe not, right? And then another part kind of research that I want to bring up is it relates to this parity issue, right? So when you look at, parity, I really think that that is going to give us a false sense of gender equality, particularly when the position is rationed. So you really need to be looking at, just like when Gary Becker was kind of talking about loans, the loan market for African Americans, he was saying it's not enough to condition on income and education and occupation and say, look, black applicants are rejected at the same rate as white applicants. You really need to look at the attributes of people who get the loan. So were black applicants actually a better credit risk than white applicants? Do they default less upon getting a loan? And when you looked at it that way, that would be a better test for discrimination. If you look in our context, I really want to know those women who are getting to managerial level positions or higher level technical positions, did they have to work much harder to get that position? Did they have to quantitatively and qualitatively work much harder to get into that role? Even if at that very rationed role, it's 50-50, are all the women much better than all the men? And judging by the first panel, I think, yes, these were amazing women, and amazing in so many ways in their thoughtfulness and their eloquence. And I really think it would be difficult to replicate that kind of panel with a random selection of men from these grade levels. And so when I see that, it's also, I don't know if in an institution where women are likely held to a higher standard, where it's difficult, where you're kind of facing not just the social norms of the country that you're working in, like the US, but all the different norms that people from all over the world are bringing to the workplace, and whether someone who looks like me is able to disagree with them in a pleasant way. When I say, oh, is that the right denominator? I often get, you're being way too technical, whereas a man might be like, oh, that's a brilliant point. And so when I see these kind of two attributes about the job itself and the face time that's required, and then the bias that might be present even in the face of parity, I must say I'm not hoping for promotion. I'm more hoping for replicating that experience that I had, in which I really feel my skills and all the investments I've made and my parents have made in me have come to use.
Thanks very much, Alika. Let me turn to Florencia next with the same question.
Sure. Thanks, Art, Ishani, and CGD for the invitation and for organizing this. First of all, this is really, I think, really important. I guess my view and my perspective comes from being a Latin American with 2 school-age kids, 15 years about at the IDB, so it might differ from others, but I'm sure my situation is not unique. When it comes to career obstacles for women, I think there are like 2 visions out there. The Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, where it says, I did it, if you fight for it, you'll do it. That's one. And then there is this famous a decade ago article of Anne-Marie Slaughter in The Atlantic saying why women still can't have it all. And she says, because if you have it all, it's because you're either superhuman, but rich, or self-employed. And I think both visions are mediated by how labor markets, and including the multilaterals, are structured. I think you can work really hard, really fight for it, and still don't get it if the labor market structure and the family support is not there. And you can't have it all, but the price, family-wise, will be super high, long time away from young kids, stress, mental health, divorce, you name it. And I think, again, labor market structure rewards career progression in that labor market structure, and family support model or mediate these 2 visions. Coming to my own 3, I would say 3 main challenges. I think the first, and Anna, the Swedish lady, was mentioning this morning, is social norms are built in early childhood. Nobody in my school, in my family, or in my neighborhood ever taught me how to negotiate, how to be assertive. This is partly cultural, I'm sure. But I remember a few years ago, I was telling my mom, it was early December, I wanted to make the case for my boss for a promotion. And she said to me, Florence, he's too busy, he will be certainly too stressed. Don't ask him, no, forget about it. We all know now that that's not the way. So I learned too late, and thanks to the IDB HR institutional courses on negotiation and presentation skills, I'm very thankful for. It came too late, but I learned those skills that didn't come from my culture, and also from great mentors and colleagues. The second thing is that social norms shape childcare decisions. Claudia Goldin, we all know her work, and the birth of a first child changes women's behavior, but not men's. So that shapes wage differentials, but that also shapes promotions. Alaka was just telling that perfectly. High managerial positions at the IFIs imply long travel, long hours. So that's not something that you can combine with being an active and present parent. I still remember, and the first panel was talking about phases. When I had a lot of mission travels, I was the team leader of, Ana Maria was mentioned this thing of being a team leader of Alone, traveling a lot during my children were babies, and pumping in ministries' toilets, in airports, crazy flight schedules to be back home soon, not to talk about the pandemic, where the juggling of family and work life was reached unprecedented levels. And the third challenge, which I've been facing more recently, I have to say, and many have mentioned it in the first panel, is how your day-to-day, your work plan, your visibility can be shaped at many levels by biases in your institution. Because that work plan and that tasks you do every day will determine your probabilities of promotion in the end. So this Linda Babcock's The No Club book, she mentions the non-promotable tasks that in Ishani's podcast was also very present. Those are tasks that are essential for our organization, but are not necessarily part of our core work that allow us advance in our careers. I've been many times asked to go to meetings or conference or do these invisible tasks like organization of big events or being in a panel because a man couldn't do it. And women are often more tasked with these non-promotable tasks or invisible tasks than men. And they feel really bad saying no because there is an expectation that they will say yes. And I think this helping others there is more a norm that women should do it rather than men, but at least in my part of the world. In terms of solutions, how could we overcome this? I've been thinking 3 or 4. I think first, these mentorship, coaching, institutional courses are super helpful for these negotiation skills, presentation skills, particularly for junior level women. The second is career progression that is family friendly. It's not just about the lactation and the paternity and maternity leave. That's just a grain of salt. It's about flexibility, really. It's location, hours, interrupted hours, WhatsApp during the weekend only if they are really urgent. Some code that could allow women to advance while having families. The third is awareness in upper management that the ladies in the first panel certainly have, but some male is more heterogeneous. I have an anecdote here that I think it reflects very nicely what I mean. A manager a few years ago in the social sector was supposed to moderate a panel, an all-male panel, so they were all males. And he had some other meeting to attend, so he left my division chief to moderate that panel. So we're going to be a moderator, male, and the speakers also males. And my division chief said, no, I'm going to ask Florencia to moderate the panel. She's totally capable of doing this, and it's not going to be an all-male panel. He had the awareness of, in a way, fighting the hierarchical levels in the institution to make a step. And those little steps, I think, they really matter. The other third point, I think, that could help with that is those biases sometimes are ingrained in the institutions. And I have an example from my country, from Argentina, a few years ago with these feminist movements. They created the Commissions of Equal Opportunities and Treatment. And they are in each ministry. And when women are suffering gender biases systematically, they can go there. I'm not sure in the IFIs today, beyond going to the ombudsman, which is too drastic, women that are subject to gender biases, there is a place where they can go. I think that that's important. And last but not least, Ishani's report, I mean, and her co-authors. This is important because there is data showing how women in IFIs are tracking progress, and that give us light of where should we do better, what should we do different, what should we do more.
Thanks, Florencia. Adana, would you like to go next?
Yes, of course. See, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, where do you want to be in 10 years? I probably would have had an answer that somewhere like, I want to be a neurosurgeon, professor of neurosurgery, because I started off as a medical doctor. And since that time, twists and turns. I had an accident that nearly paralyzed me. My family sold their car, and I was like, health financing, there's something there. Why is it I have the best doctors in the world, and I'm here thinking about how to pay for my health care? I need to solve this problem. And then after I graduated, I was sent to northern Nigeria to work, and I was there, and I would sit in this clinic, and hundreds of women would troop with their kids to see me from far villages, right? There was one woman I can't get out of my mind. Her child has meningitis, and I want to admit this boy. And she says, I cannot make this decision. I need to take him back to my husband to give me money to pay for admission fees. How is it possible that this boy is about to die? His mother cannot make a decision. The clinic is 2 hours away from her. This is not right. And so I go do a master's at Oxford. I go to Harvard, I do a PhD. I work in the bank for 7 years, the World Bank. When you say the bank, usually means the World Bank. Advising health policy. And then now I work at Visa. And the job that I'm in at Visa did not exist 10 years ago. It is one of those roles that came up in the private sector in the wake of George Floyd, and corporations thinking about how can we be intentional about engaging in the world and using business for good. Which is why my answer today will not focus on position. It's sort of going to focus on what is the framework in which I want to think about sort of the future and 10 years ahead. One of it is my why, right? So, the thing that has been constant throughout like the 10 years or so for me has been that I care deeply about inequities in access to healthcare and opportunity. I think it's deeply unfair that because I was born in Nigeria, in a poor family, it was a lot harder for me to get to Oxford and Harvard. I don't think that's right. I think everyone should have opportunity. People should have incomes, the ability to make decisions about their lives. They should have access to healthcare. I want to keep working on those problems. I want that to be my life's work, moving the needle on that. Now, the ways in which I engage in that space has evolved over time as a function of opportunity. Right? If I got a degree and I got certain skills, then I was able to engage differently. And those opportunities were shaped in part by sponsorship, right? They were shaped by, I had one conversation in Imperial College when I was doing my Oxford degree with Rifat Atun, and he says, I think you have talent, I think you should get into Oxford, and he sent one email. Now, I'm sure hundreds of people applied to that PhD. Right? But I got in. And I'm a very, very capable person. I had a distinction in my Oxford degree, right? And I'm sure I should have gotten into a great PhD. But in my career, sponsorship has mattered. I recently navigated, before I left the bank, a very difficult promotion in which, some of the people who were getting promoted ahead of me didn't have as much experience. What changed the narrative for me was a sponsor. Right? And so when I think about 10 years ahead, a couple of things come to mind to me. Is the problem I'm working on, is the kinds of skills I want to build. The ability to navigate complex environments, complex discussions, negotiate difficult agreements, and those kinds of things, to drive change in bureaucracies, within governments, within the private sector. Because the kinds of things I want to do is to help shape the movement of capital, whether it's in the public sector, in the bank, like I was doing when I was negotiating difficult reforms, or it's in the private sector and the trillions of dollars in transactions, the ways in which they move and how they shape opportunity. That's the sort of work I want to do. When I think about what that implies for the institutions I have worked in and the ones I work in now, I think it's a different way of thinking about careers. What if we didn't focus on positions and we focus on competencies? What does it look like to map out growth in terms of what are the skills you build that make you more and more effective at engaging in this space? It then opens up options. Suddenly the barriers around you are not the barriers of your institution, it's the world. Where can I learn negotiation? Where can I learn change management? Those are the kinds of questions that I would ask myself when I was thinking about the next step. And the second thing I think it calls to mind is sponsorship. There was a couple of comments on the panel before us about networks. This is where decisions, as you get more and more senior, it's not about you being great at analysis or great at writing. Your name needs to come up in the right spaces, and multiple people need to echo the thought that this person should get the job. right? And that's the kind of, that's what gives you a senior director role at Visa, and that's what is probably going to get me my next role, right? And so I think we need to think intentionally, because many of the people who are in those rooms right now, they don't look like me. They're not female, they're not male. So who's going to bring up the name if it's like an Adana, right? And I think in our institutions, we need to have that conversation. Who's bringing up the names of the black women? Who's bringing up the names of the Indian women? Who's bringing up the names of the Chinese men, right? And if no one is bringing up their names, and it's because they're not getting opportunities to grow, let's give them those opportunities, and let's bring up their names.
Thanks very much, Adana. And that's a topic of like processes and how hiring processes work that I want to come back to a little later in the panel. But first, Bernice, on this opening question, your
Great,
thoughts.
thanks, Art. And again, thanks for the organization and for the invitation. Gosh, it's really hard to follow after these three very articulate and passionate young women. I've actually been in the bank a little bit longer, and I've been actually in a managerial position for like over 15 years now. So I've been lucky enough to have found mentors, really people who believed in me early on in my bank career, and just sort of a little bit the way Anna was describing, sort of saw that capacity, untapped capacity that I wasn't using, and kind of pushed me very, better first-time manager position. It was my male director who said, you are applying for this job. And I was like, me? Really? Like, why would I, me? And I, but it was very much the same when I became global director, It was my vice president who insisted, you need to apply for this job. So I've been fortunate. I've had a lot of really good experiences that way in my career in the bank. In terms of management and mentors, really encouraging me in pursuing, my career. And one of the things that I think I suffer from, and we haven't heard too much about yet, but I do really think holds women back, is this sort of this imposter syndrome. No, I think many of us don't necessarily believe that we are ready to be, the lead technical specialist, or, because we haven't had quite as many or enough publications maybe that we, hold ourselves accountable for. We don't believe we're ready to be a manager of a team of 50 people. So I think a lot of it really is also to do with, again, how do we encourage? I try and do that with my staff a lot. How do I encourage? I chair one of these nebulous talent boards, no? and one of the categories we have, which is not an official HR category, but one of the categories we have is we call quiet stars. Who are my quiet stars that, I don't see or hear from all the time in meetings or, but who are actually, really talented people that we need to invest in, that we need to encourage. And I try to have conversations with my quiet stars. I invite them, we'll have a lunch or a coffee and have chats, because I think it's really important that we keep doing that. And a lot of our women, I think, are talented women. Not all of them. Some of them are very outspoken, very articulate, but we have a lot of them, I think, disproportionately, who are these quiet stars. Anyway, long story short, I was going to talk about where do I want to be in 10 years. And I am lucky enough to say that in 10 years, I hope to be retired from the World Bank. So that was an easy answer. But actually, it's not so easy. And I will tell this little anecdote, and it comes back to the imposter syndrome, I think, that I suffer from. So I've been thinking, as we do, and we talk at dinner parties, what are your plans? So I'm thinking, I don't know what I want to do. Maybe I love the countryside, so I've been thinking maybe I'll get a cabin and do some rewilding of some land somewhere and like have an organic sort of vegetable patch with my dog, and maybe my husband when he wants to come. And then I've also thought, well, maybe I retrain. I could be a therapist. I do, actually as a manager in the World Bank for many years, you actually spend a lot of time. Really, you're like a therapist a lot of the time. But then I was looking, okay, but that's like many years of going back to school and taking lots of exams. So I don't know what to do. And anyway, and I was talking at this dinner, and this totally random person, a man, by the way, a bit younger than me, not a lot younger, he's a research scientist, just tore into me. And he's like, what do you mean? You're just going to, at the time, I think I had just changed jobs. You're the global director for climate change at the World Bank. You have a voice. You are at your most powerful now than you'll ever be. You can't just, go off to your organic vegetable patch. You know, you have a responsibility to, you know, to be out there and fighting for the things that you believe in, and you know, in the world that you want to leave behind. It really shook me up. I had never thought of it that way. You know, again, I think it comes back to that sense of that your capacity, the idea that, you know, I would leave my job at the World Bank with, you know, halfway decent pension because I'm in the new plan and not in the old plan. I mean, those of you who are in the bank know that whole story. But I kind of thought, look, I can relax. I can, you know, I can just, but that idea, and you know, he was like, look, the man is run by old men. I mean, so the world is run by old men. Why shouldn't, you know, the world be run by old women too? And it's true, no? It's like we tend to just step back. So anyway, long story short, I haven't figured it out yet. I'm kind of thinking about it in my head, like what's that nice balance, no? Like I can still have some positive contribution, but I also would like to slow down a little bit. No, I don't think you can work at this pace, this intensity, you know, forever, but I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks very much, Bernice. So I have like a long list of questions for all of you, and just in the interests of time and also to give you more flexibility to respond, why don't I ask both the questions that I had prepared for each of you as we go next, and then you can choose to ignore them and answer something different if you think that's more appropriate, or react to others on the panel. But coming back, Alika, you already touched in your initial response on your decision to go into sort of a more analytical role within the bank, and I guess and why, you know, that motivates you, right? And I think a lot of both men and women, you know, have that view and try to stick that sort of more analytical track. But do you think that there's a differential impact for a woman to make that career choice to go into a more technical track that is different from men? And the second question, and again, you can pick whichever ones you want to respond to, but you know, as a professional woman with young children, what is like one practical thing that you would want managers to do differently, or to know, or to be aware of, that you haven't seen yet, that you think would make a big difference in all the balancing that entails?
Sure. So I'm going to take you up on your offer to react to something else first. So one thing that was common in this panel and in the first panel is this importance of mentors, right? And that actually bothers me, right? Because not everyone is lucky to get a mentor, right? You may be assigned a manager who's really biased, right? And that's kind of a bit the problem with a talent board, right? The person advocating for you is your manager. And what do you do when your manager doesn't value you, right? What do you do if you've been not lucky to be assigned to a set of people who don't value you? And so relying on this informal mentoring, I think, is really dangerous for not just the quiet stars, but for women in general. And so I think when I think about what could be a solution to this, so when I came to the bank, I came as a YP, a young professional. There was so much screening, right? You had to write essays. You had to go and have people code your behavior. I was on a panel interview. Anna Birda was one of my interviewers. They grilled you about everything that was on your CV and made you apply that to a whole set of current affairs. That was a grueling selection process. Now when I'm inside the bank and I've been on panels, there's so little thought put into hiring people, and then you do end up relying on the networks and whether the person who is the hiring manager has a preferred candidate. And the amount of bias I've seen in the way people talk about candidates, it's stunning, right? So when you see, and the bias doesn't come in with like, oh, she's a lady from Afghanistan, I don't like her. It's more like, I don't really believe she did all that work. She's stretching. She's really stretching what she did. Or, you know, behaviorally, I just don't think she's gonna fit in our unit. These are all ways that bias creeps in, and I think just formalizing the selection process for all positions, particularly for promotions, would go a long way in fixing a lot of this, right? So at the IMF, I know to be a manager, you have to go through a rigorous selection process to even be within the pool that's allowed to apply for managerial positions. And I think just particularly in these positions that are very rationed, like H level and above, maybe even G level and above, having a more rigorous process and having a process that's not just reliant on a manager to advocate for you, or a sponsor to advocate for you, I think will solve a lot of this bias. Now, getting to your question about the movement to an analytical position, because I opened saying, one of the highlights of my career was helping a country through a major reform. That happened when my daughter was like 6 or 7 months, and I was taking her on missions and nursing her between meetings. That was a really tough time. And so I must say that I fled to an analytical position so that I didn't have to kind of have such a hectic schedule, right? And when you have an analytical position, at least at the World Bank, there's a lot more control over your time. Like you can just stay up late and do your analysis and do your writing. And so in some sense, my move to an analytical position is very much determined by my gender, right? It's so that I could have control over my life and raise very young children. Because when you're raising young children, if you think of supports, the World Bank has wonderful supports, like they sponsor nannies, or people will tell you, have a nanny. But a nanny is, not going to kind of put in the time that a child needs. Like, you don't want to rely on a nanny to help your child develop emotional regulation, right? Kind of to stimulate them and play with them. That's your job as a parent. And so for having, and people brought this up, having young children and doing a really good job in an operational role is a very difficult task. And then if you, what was your the third part of your question?
What you would wish your managers had done differently.
Yes. So, well, one thing I covered it, which is I wish I were not so reliant on managers to advocate for me, because that's, you cannot control who you're assigned to and kind of what views they bring to the job and how they view you. So I do think having, these more objective selection processes, particularly for promotions, rather than having your name come up in meetings, or having that Alexia. That's wonderful. If everyone took a list of everyone that has ever impressed them, that would be great. But not everyone does that. I think so. Having more rigorous selection processes, I think, would solve that. But I also think if I go back to my experiences when I've had a manager advocate for me in a good way, I once had a manager, so often when you were working at the bank, you have, particularly if you're a task team leader, you have people who are in your unit who are under your manager's control, but people working from under other units. And I was once in a situation where the other people in other units were just not doing the work. And I was banging my head against the wall, and at the end of the day, just doing all their work. And my manager pulled me aside and said, look, I can see that you're struggling to get them to do the work. And for me, I didn't even think of gender. I was just like, oh, there are a bunch of people at the bank who don't do the work. There are a bunch of people who do a lot of the work. And I'm like the unlucky sucker who does all the work. That's what I was thinking. But he said, no, I do sense gender bias here. Like if you were a male, or if you were a female who was a way more aggressive person when dealing with people, you might not be in this situation. And he said, let's brainstorm on how we can fix this. And what I really liked about what he did was he helped me brainstorm about what I could do. He didn't just say, hey, copy me and escalate it so I could take care of it. He really gave me some options that I could do that fit with my personality to kind of try to get these other people to do the work. And so I think that is something I think managers can do. And I think this gets to what Florencia said, giving women the skills to be able to kind of overcome some of these biases, but still remain themselves, right? So that you're not going through like a personality change, I think, and doing this in a quiet way, right? So that the woman can develop those skills, I think is very helpful. And so I don't believe our managers at the bank have training in order to help women do this. And so I think that would be something I think, no one is, when you come to the bank, you're not trained. How do you empower others, right? We don't get this training. And so I think doing training like this before you become a manager or before you're in a supervisory role, I think would be really helpful.
So this is really spot on, and I think it's also a very good transition to for me to turn to Bernice, who is somebody who's been a manager for a long time at the World Bank, to kind of get your views. As a manager, how do you see this role of, say, empowering staff to be able to self-advocate versus your role as, the senior person, to whom things escalate, the way that you said just a moment ago. So how do you strike that balance? And
that was in my
no, and if I can just sort of squeeze in the other sort of scripted question we had before, but adapt it a little bit to this as well, which is, what's one thing that sort of surprised you the most about, say, your interactions with a woman who reports to you about the challenges that she might be facing, that you thought, wow, I never saw that happening in all my time in the bank. So what surprised you the most?
So on the first one, on the empowering, I mean, without sounding defensive, because there's a lot of bad managers in the bank, absolutely. But there are a lot of very good managers in the bank also. I just want to recognize that. And they do all get training. And it's continuous training and coaches. And so it's not like it's a completely, blind box. I think it looks like a blind box from staff's perspective very often, but I think there has been some investment. Is it enough? No. Can we do more? Absolutely. A lot of work is around empowering not just women, but also other underrepresented populations within our staff. So again, someone mentioned the East Asian, often just quiet by culture, not speaking up sometimes when. So it's learning how to empower those staff. And as I say, sometimes it's about whether you call it quiet stars or whatever you want to call it, but it's recognizing those people and helping them grow in their roles, giving them also the stretch assignment or etc. But in terms of look, it's a balancing act. Again, each manager, it comes a bit back to authenticity, in terms of how you deal with that kind of situation. I would also, my first instinct would be to try and get the staff to resolve the issues themselves. If it's this kind of issue, if one or two attempts don't work, then it's like, well, then let's escalate it and go and talk to that other team's manager, because clearly they're not listening and they need to understand that that's not the way to go. There are other things happening still, unfortunately, and nobody's mentioned it today, but we still see sexual harassment in the institution, and some of it is staff on staff, and some of it is very much senior men, harassing junior women. I don't think it's as widespread as it used to be even, 10, 15 years ago, but it still exists. So those kinds of things, when they come to me, you need to go to the ethics people. That needs to be fully, reported, investigated, and stamped out, right? Now, what is more serious, what I think is holding women back, honestly, is that there is a lot of sexual harassment of team leaders by clients. It's really tricky. I mean, I worked in Latin America for many years. I've been in some really tricky situations with a minister of this, that, or the other who thought, he kind of had me almost a little bit hostage, because if I didn't go and have the drinks in the evening, he would not agree to sign the aid memoir or, send the letter of request to the country director. So there's a lot of that still. And Latin America, it happens, but the same, I worked in South Asia for many years, same thing. I mean, there's still a lot of sexual harassment and sexism out there with clients. And there, I think we've really not come up with good answers as an institution. How do we support our women staff when they are face-to-face with clients who are absolutely misbehaving and who are not, who are not, showing the values that we say that we believe in. No? And it's not easy. Obviously, it's not easy, and you have to find a way to navigate that. What surprises me still today, it doesn't, I should, maybe I thought about that one too, and I thought it's more that it surprised me as I grew up in the bank. We talk a lot about the mothers of young children. I have bad news for you. Those are the golden years. You know, finding a good daycare or, you know, a good babysitter is easy. It gets really hard when they're teenagers. No, you can't send your teenager to daycare, but you know, I have so many colleagues, and certainly my own. I have raised 3 boys, so I'm still raising, I don't know, they're between 18 and 25. But you know, there's so many staff, so many colleagues, friends who are going, thinking, you know, kids with mental health issues, you know, daughters with eating disorders, you know, struggling in school, stress about getting into college. I mean, there's so much of that happening that you as a parent, you can't outsource that stuff. No, it's not about, oh, are they making the organic puree the way I want to do it and make sure they eat it at 5 p.m. No, that's what you do with the 3-year-old. I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but so for me, that was something that I always thought, oh, if I get through these baby years, you know, then I'm home dry. No, I can. Actually, turns out it's quite the contrary. Those I could plan, I could get my child care in place, and it was much more. It was in some ways easier. And then, you know, the other thing we haven't talked about at all, and I think women take the brunt of that as well, is elder care. I mean, I see a lot of women in the bank are increasingly like, look, I have elderly parents, and who looks after the elderly parents? And again, we're far away, so it's difficult. And, you know, there's a lot of that burden of both, you know, of responsibility, but also I think the emotional labor of a lot of that falls on women. And I think it holds us back sometimes, and it makes us make choices that sometimes are not to go up in the organization, right? Sometimes you make a choice because of all these other responsibilities that you stay flat in the organization, and that's a perfectly valid, of course, choice to make. But as an institution or as institutions, I think the more flexibility we can provide, the more we can allow, you know, it's okay to step back for 1 or 2 years if you have a family situation or for whatever reason you need to step back for a bit, and then you come back in without having, you know, that penalized, I think is something that we really need to look at. And then the last thing I'll say, because I know Hishani has really wanted me to talk about this. In the bank, unfortunately, I think very unfortunately, some years ago, a rule was put in place that if you wanted to get promoted to what we call this H level, which is the lead position, which is the sort of managerial cadre, you have to have done a field assignment. So there was a whole thing about you have to have done a 3 or 4 year stint in one of our client countries. Now that I think was, I don't know to what extent that explains our slowing down, but what happens is that it's still harder for working women with, you know, to have, they just don't have trailing spouses to the same extent as men have. No, I think often for men, it's like they go and maybe they have a spouse, they have young children, and the wife is like, well, you know, I'll take a few years off. It's okay, I can make it work, and they go. It's just a lot trickier for the working women, no, to have the spouse trail to come, put their career on hold, and go out to you know, a field assignment for 3 or 4 years. So I think that's been one that's really. I think it's being looked at. I'm not sure it's still applied as hard, but for a while we had one HR VP who was absolutely adamant, 100%, like you would not get that promotion unless you had done the field assignment. So that one is really, really penalizes women. You know, we need to be flexible. Again, coming back to the flexibility, life gets messy. You know, people get divorced, people have shared custody, people have primary custody. You know, there's so many things that happen in our staff's lives that we have to build flexibility around so that they can still thrive and still, you know, obviously do the work that, you know, we need to do, but recognizes all of those things. So I'll leave it there.
Oh, thanks very much, Bernice. I'm mindful of the fact that Ishani's colleague is desperately waving this sign at me to go to audience questions. But maybe if I can just perhaps a little bit more briefly go quickly to Adana and to Florencia, okay. And then we'll encroach on lunch by a few minutes maybe. I think people won't mind because I'm sure there's many things people want to ask the panel. So Adana, you're in a position of just recently having left the World Bank. So you've had experience in the World Bank, you're in the private sector now. Is there one or more aspect of the IFI work environment, which is really the focus of this discussion, that treats women differently, whether it's better or worse than in the private sector? And is there something that the one could learn from the other?
Well, I'm hoping not to put my former and current employer at odds with each other, so I'll try and be diplomatic as I answer that. I left the bank about 6 months ago and joined Visa as Senior Director of Global Impact Measurement. And just to walk you through how I got there, right? So 6 months ago, I'm at what I consider the pinnacle of my career, right? I have recently navigated a very difficult promotion, have sponsors in the bank. I'm doing great work. 2 or 3 very tricky countries, usually given to very senior, the former leads in those countries were GHs. And I am in 2 or 3 of them, the largest portfolios in the region, leading cross-sectoral work, etc. Have great mentors, great sponsor. And then what's the next step? Logically, it's a field assignment. Because if you're going to become a H, you have to go to the field. So I go for the first interview, I get the position, and I say, I just can't go. I have some personal issues right now. Let's wait 6 months later, right? And then 6 months later, another interview position. And these are very hard to get, right? I get through the whole thing, and I get the second position. And then now I have to face up to where I am, right? So if I can't move to the field, because there's some things happening in my personal life, I need to be close to my family, I need to be close to my doctors. If I stay in DC, my career, as far as I see it, is dead, right? So I'm not going to get promoted again, and I will never be satisfied doing the same thing for the next 20 years. And then, even if I do go to the field, it so happens that there is no technical lead specialist of African descent in the health GP. I said, even if I do go all the way, go to the field, continue leading these portfolios, give up my social life, give up my personal goals, what are the odds that I will really be able to occupy this space of leadership technically that I am aiming for? Very slim, right? And so, I had mentors, I had sponsors, I had coaches, and I sat down and I said, the thing I want to work on is access to healthcare. The thing I want to work on is opportunity. Where can I get opportunities to grow that do not require me to give up everything else? And that is what took me to Visa, right? And so I think my journey in some ways, I think, reflects some of the great things about the bank. I think the manager I had at the bank is one of the best managers I've had in my life. She was a manager and a mentor. The director I reported to was a sponsor. I got great assignments. I just spoke to you about my work portfolio. That's amazing. I was the only Black, for a long time, Black technical staff within health in that region. And I had the best assignments. I was doing great work, right? But at the same time, it's also a reflection of the constraints on the career of a woman and the career of someone who is of African descent, because I did not think it was realistic to expect that I would move up the ladder. And I didn't think it was realistic that I would be able to get to do the work that I wanted to do, and I had to seek those opportunities elsewhere. I do feel like, in my current position, that there is more of a, one of the things that was navigated when I was doing my last promotion in the bank is they had to lay out what are the competencies to become a G and a H. Because I was going for interviews, I was being shortlisted, and people who hadn't led projects were getting promoted. I said, why? I need to understand, what am I missing? And then there's, you've checked every box. I said, can we write those boxes down? For Gs and for Hs, what it will take, right? And I think in the current organization I work in, there is a PDF that lays out what it will take to become VP. It's very clear. And when you feel like you're at that point, you have the conversation with your manager. I think I'm ready. And there's an intentionality about if you think we're ready and there are gaps, these are the assignments and how you prove yourself. There is a rating. This is very open. And, and I really feel more in control of my trajectory, right? But I think in general, out of this experience, one of the things I've taken is the opportunities don't have to exist in the current institution. I tend to focus on skills, competencies, and where can I build this? It doesn't have to be in the bank. It doesn't have to be in Visa. And that's the sort of approach I think I want to take moving forward, and the approach I encourage other people to take, right? So I joined the World Bank as a young professional. I remember when we joined, it was about the same, women and men. And then first year ending, almost all the men had become team leads. I think I was one of only maybe 2 or 3 women who had, become task team leader, because they're like, oh, YPs are too junior. But all the junior YP males, they were all team leads. Slowly but surely, by second year, third year, I think 3 out of 5 of the African women who came into the YP program had left the bank. One of them, microaggressions, she was basically pushed out. One of them was thrown under the bus. The other, and then now it's me. I think I'm number 4. I think there's one of us who's left, holding on by a thread, has been given an offer by another development bank and is trying to decide what to do with it. And for many of us, it's been, I don't have a sponsor. I don't have opportunities for growth. I'm experiencing discrimination. In some cases, not that it's not obvious, but there was something happening. Like, why am I not getting these opportunities? And these other people are getting these opportunities. I do think we have to have an honest conversation, not just about the metrics on who is at this level, but that process. We keep calling the pipeline. Can we measure the pipeline? Who becomes the team lead? Who gets the big portfolio assignments? Who gets the complex country? Because that's how you get ready for GH. You have managed across sectors, you have managed, it's $1 billion, it's $500 million, you've managed the FCV. If you can't go to the field, what are the alternatives? I think it's striking that it was easier for me to go to a private sector company outside the bank than to navigate the move to IFC. I don't know how many times I wrote to the IFC, oh, I'm here, I think the private sector would be great, I'd like to work here for a couple of, no callback, or sometimes a callback where, you don't have an MBA, why? You see, so I think, those are the kinds of things we should look at. What are the ways in which we're creating opportunities for people to cultivate the competencies to rise? So we're not just looking at, we don't have enough people at GH ready. That process is there, and we're losing really capable people in that process because we're not intentional about cultivating them.
No, I think that's really interesting. It actually connects a lot with the discussion in the first panel, where I think at least 2 of the speakers were emphasizing very much the importance of having much more structured and much more intentional processes. Right. Perhaps not writing down a recipe for GH. I'm not sure how one does that, but I think that the spirit of being more intentional about the processes and whether that would make a difference, which then leads into one of the question you get. I guess you get the last word in the panel. No, let's take that. So one of the things that I understand you've done at the IDB is set up a mentoring program to help women particularly prepare for interviews, which I think loom larger and larger the more structured and the more intentional the promotion processes are. And maybe you can say a little bit more about sort of why that was necessary, what it's accomplishing, and perhaps connected to this, how do we make processes more intentional so that people don't feel like they have to rely on the randomness of having had a good manager or having had a good mentor?
Yes, Ana Maria mentioned it a bit in the first panel. Our network called in IDB, We Connect, the We is Women Economists. And the start of it all, let me give a step back, was the 2017 Latin American and Economic Association conference in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And it's a funny one because I think one of the senior staff from CGD at the time tweeted about that. The key speakers, were like 20, this is the second largest economic association of the world, were put in a poster. They were like 25 males. So it was even funny. It was really funny, but nobody was aware of that. There were 25 males when in Latin America 50% of undergraduates are females. And there are many that could have been there. So that was outrageous, so outrageous that I think we started to talk at the IDB about what can we do. And in the 2018, so the next year, executive committee of the LACEA meeting, the WILAC, that Ana Maria also mentioned, Women Economists of Latin America, was launched. So WILAC was an inspiration for us at the IDB that the IDB has many women's networks, but not women economist networks. And why that emphasis? Because we know that many fields are male-dominated, but econ is among the worst. And it's also important because we know that gender diversity, and we are many economists at the IDB, do make better performance in teams. Gender diversity also, because of the different views between male and female, have different impacts on policy making. There is evidence, for instance, that the pandemic was better handled by prime ministers or presidents that were females. And there was a lot of progress. You've seen there are 2 of our current vice presidents out of 3 that are women, 50% of country office representatives are women. A lot of progress, very recent, happened really the last 2-3 years, but there's still a lot of progress to be done. Managerial progression is not that great. It's only 28% of managers that are women. So with that in mind, we had this network of women economists, and it's a little bit more than interviewing. It's also about women career progression economists in the IDB, but also beyond the IDB, and regardless of their stage level. So we launched it in 2022, and I think the results, you talk about the results, we started the 6 founding members, and today, 1 year later, we are 250 active members, 1/3 consultants. The activities, Ana Maria mentioned our lunches. Tomorrow is actually going to be the 5th and the last lunch of the year, where 2 women, 1 staff, 1 consultant. We'll select them really carefully. There has to be representativity across sectors, across the IDB groups, so IDB Invest, IDB Lab, and IDB. We'll present their work in this safe space to give constructive feedback in a safe space. And we are also working to launch next year the mentoring with HR, the mentoring program. And there is a tool that we also developed called We Connect Finder, I think is an Excel file where all the members, we put our soft skills, technical skills, area of expertise. So if you're looking for someone that wants to know more about urban development or gender or something, then you can get and have a quick call. And just to close quickly, I think that the keys for this nice experience of this network has been that we really thought that for women it was important to make it approachable. So any email we get from these 250, we try to make, even if we are like super busy, to respond, to have a quick coffee, to have a quick call, approachable, based on trust, because these women are sharing with us a lot of things, like my boss doesn't respond to my emails for 2 months, like things like really important. So based on trust and demand-driven. They were the ones saying, we did a quick survey at the beginning, 44% were citing like the top concern, professional development. So that's how the lunches started.
Okay. Great, thanks very much, Florencia. Let me open up for a few quick questions, and then I'll ask the panelists to sort of tie themselves to 30-second responses, sort of like those like Sunday morning TV talk shows, just to leave us all with a parting shot. So you can start thinking about your parting shot as we have a few questions. So Paul, please go ahead. And then, sorry, there's somebody further back who I both don't know and can't quite see, sorry.
Thanks, Paul Canario, like many others here, a World Bank retiree, and now at the University of Toronto. What shocks me is that I could have heard these stories 11 years ago when I retired, and I can think of examples 20 years ago, probably 25 years ago. What one thing would you change so that 10 years from now, women of your the next generation don't tell the same stories? Thanks.
Yeah. That's a great topic for your parting shot.
Yes. Hello, my name is Katie Anise. I really appreciated what you were sharing about parenting responsibilities, particularly not just the first 5 years, but 18, there's 13 years from 5 to 18. People who are single parents or caring, to leave a child. And when you get into senior levels of management, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% travel. And, some women, as our first questioner, was not willing to make the shift. People, as you say, you have this big influx, and then they level out during what corresponds with those growing years of a child. So I'm wondering, how do we recognize that this is not just a 8 or 10-hour job, it's a 24-hour job that people are being called to? How do we also look at men? In the education and human development and ECD sectors, I see a preponderance of women. Sometimes in like the global leads, I see like one man among 50 who are like the top evaluation specialists. And so how do we think about, is it healthy for a man to be able to have to take a full-time job where he's also 50% time traveling and leaving young children? How do we encourage like both parenting responsibilities, co-parenting, and recognize that in the years when people will be promoted is in the time when their children most need them, and need them not to be traveling and not to be working 10 hours a day. So I'm just thinking about how do we flip our way of thinking and also have a child-centered way of thinking.
Please.
Hi, thanks so much for this. My name's Kate, I work at Oxfam. On the question of the kind of mentoring question that a lot in the first panel it came up as well, like mentoring and the importance of mentoring and networking. And I think over the course of my career, I've really kind of gone back and forth on this. Like for a while, I really thought the answer was for like everyone to stop kind of the insider networking and like, don't contact the hiring manager and say, oh, I know this person who'd be great for the job, and get their resume to the top of the pile. And then I kind of quickly realized that actually men are doing that all the time. So now I'm very active in like reaching out, in support of like brilliant young women that I know to recommend them. And I'm very eager to hear from people outside in my network if they have someone to recommend. So I'm just interested to hear from you about that balance between the kind of playing the game and the kind of taking the high road. And like, I do think that's sometimes a tension and it's sometimes difficult. So I'm interested to hear how you navigate that. Thank you.
All right, last question.
Thank you. My name is Daniela. I also work at the World Bank. I'm a junior professional associate working on gender. And I have to say, seeing you all, it's really paving the way. This is the reality that I know. Like, you can be a strong, independent, empowering women in leadership positions. My question is, what is a piece of advice that you would give someone who is starting their career in economics? And maybe if you could think of what you would tell yourself, what you would have told yourself when you were starting your career, something that would have changed the direction of your life. Thank you.
All right, great. Bernice, 30 seconds.
Okay,
and
30
make
seconds.
it even more complicated by, I spoke too soon saying that Paul's question was a great question, because all 4 questions are actually excellent ones. So pick one and we'll see who we have left, which ones we have left as we come along.
I mean, the one thing in 10 years we'd like to see changed, I think, is this allyship. No, men need to be part of this conversation, much more than women changing, or even the flexibility that we need to start providing as an institution. It's about men picking up the slack as much as women. I'm going to be very frank in terms of advice. And I have this conversation with a lot of my younger staff, men and women. The bank is not for everyone. If you're not passionate about development and you're not passionate about traveling to all of these places and know that you're going to have to spend a good amount of your time doing that, it may not be the place for you to advance your career. And it's a hard pill to swallow, because you do have to make trade-offs sometimes, in terms of your personal life, your family. But if you, I guess it's the leaning in or whatever to have it all. No, you cannot have it all. I mean, it's impossible. Because as an institution, we are, at the end of the day, we need to be there when COVID hits, and we need to have our projects out there in 100 days, right, to 30 or 60 countries. There is no choice. So it's having a few of these tough conversations at times as well, that we recognize you make a very conscious choice about some of these trade-offs, and you are aware of what they are, without thinking, oh, I'm going to start my career, and then you invest 5 years and then realize, actually, this is really not who I want to be or what I can do. So,
thanks very much, Bernice. Florencia.
Yeah, I think I also pick up on yours and a little bit on Kate's on the mentor and the advice. A little bit for both, for the mentor. I think one has to be really alert on what resources are out there. It might be the private sector, the public, or the multilaterals. Like these mentorships or these courses, I was like, there might be an extra thing when I started also as a YP. But in the end, 5 years down the line, I said, oh, no, this negotiation skill course really changed my mind, really, because my mom was telling me to do the opposite. So it was, as a young professional, I think, take advantage, be alert, and take every course possible and every support possible, because sometimes we think, no, I'm going to keep on doing my work properly in my office and not get out on the other supports, professional and technical and soft skills. That's one I think is important. Supporting Bernie's point on these type of development jobs are not for everyone, but I think this might be too late, but who you marry is important. It's extremely important. She talked about the trailing spouses or not. You can be stuck in a place or have to follow your husband if he's the one that's more ambitious or whatever, or less supportive. I think if you have the passion, if you are convinced that that's what I meant in my answer to the family support system. It includes mostly your husband. And I think so being alert, making sure you have a family support, particularly your husband. And the third thing is trying to change, and this was a lot here, that men, either from this awareness that a previous boss, I told about this all-male panel, and supporting women, they need to have, that's what I also would like to share, that future wish that will change the younger generation.
Adana.
We all seem to be answering the same questions, but I think I'll start with you. I think it's really, when I was a first-year YP, I ran into a mission with Axel, who is now Senior Managing Director. At the time he was Vice President. We spent hours together. And the one thing that he left me with was this idea, your career is yours to administer. It's not your manager's business. It's not primarily, you are the one sort of think through what is my trajectory, what skills do I need, and to navigate with that with support from people, but you take responsibility for your career. And I think it's really important you do that. As a YP, sometimes you forget that because so much has been structured for you. You have leadership programs, the YP is 2 years, and there are all these rotations you're supposed to do, and you get this sense that people have thought of this projection for you over the next 5 years to glory. That is not what's going to happen. 2 years after that, you're going to drop off, and you have to think about using the YP and the time after for yourself. Institutionally, I'm hoping to see a different way of thinking about careers, right? So in COVID, someone who now is the only Black practice manager in health, basically had to move heaven and earth to get there, by the way, prepared a project in an FCV environment in 7 days from DC. Do I need to be in the country to be effective? Since I left the bank, I have had former advisors to prime ministers, ministers of health, etc., travel to meet with me. I am not in the bank. They considered me a trusted advisor, even now that I'm not in the bank, and I never lived in those countries. Do I need to be in the field to build that relationship and that trust? I think our institutions should evolve to reflect the reality of Zoom, of WebEx, of Microsoft Teams, and in other ways. We need institutions that do not just focus on mentorship. They have sponsorship, fellow programs. Why are we always shifting responsibility to this person, to sit with someone else and brainstorm on problems that are structural? No, we need the same way we have mentorship programs and all these cohorts where we sit and we talk about how bad things are. We need sponsorship programs where people take responsibility to give people who have talent opportunity and move them along the way, right? So what I'm hoping for in 10 years is a different way for looking at careers. If we keep saying it's your responsibility to manage all these problems, even though we know you're not, someone on the talent board is going to pick, this guy over you. If we keep saying you have to go to the field, then how does the woman with the young kids cope? How does the person who has medical challenges cope? And these people are talented people. I think as an institution, we should feel very badly that we're losing so many really good people. The Black people left my cohort. They're senior people in central banks. They are managers in other. These are not people who are underperformers. They're not people who didn't love development. They love development. They're still working development, just in institutions that understand them, have adapted to their needs, and created career paths for them that are tailored.
You get the last word, Alaka.
Yeah, so If you had asked me this question 5 years ago, before the pandemic, I would have said flexibility is the one thing that would help women. And the pandemic kind of left that to us. So that's one good thing that has come out of the pandemic is the social norm of more flexibility in terms of your working hours, when you work, and some understanding. I think people are really understanding now that people have lives, and these lives affect their work. So today, given that the pandemic took care of the flexibility problem, if I'm going to answer Paul's question, and it's a little bit echoing what I've heard here, I really think we need to solve this career progression issue, and we really need to be more deliberate about how we select people and how they move up and what kind of assignments they get. So I had proffered one way to do this would be to be more deliberate in kind of hiring and promotions with kind of selection. But even I think even taking one step earlier to that, how we need to be more deliberate and ensure fairness in what assignments people are getting in order to build their careers. And this affects not just women, but also underrepresented people, and more importantly, people in our country offices. So I don't, sitting in Washington, I get the sense that we don't have enough appreciation for the local expertise that we already have employed in the institution. And there's this premise, when we bring people for our biannual trainings, that people in Washington are giving training to people coming from the country offices. I think we need to reverse that a little bit, but also include people in country offices, underrepresented minorities, and women be a little more deliberate in the task assignment and making sure not just that promotions are fair, but that the things that are getting people promotions, the task assignments, are done more deliberately. And some of this is not just bias. Some of this is just the task of a manager at the bank is just enormous, right? I once was on mission where managers were trading secrets about their prescription ulcer medications, right? And so it's just not easy being a manager. And so supporting a manager, managers have so many tasks. The one I just articulated is a big one, right? Making sure that there's fairness in even task assignment. I think that's a hard job, and so maybe, we can't just say, oh, let the managers do it. I think we need to build a support system in order to make that actually happen and have that be something that is on the checklist for what gets done in task assignments and in promotions.
Thank you very much, Alika. And the rest of our panel, Adana, Bernice, and Florencia. Sorry.
Indulge me with just one last
Please.
Can we wait for a mic?
Both panels
Do we have,
have been
if you mind waiting for the mic, please.
Both panels have been absolutely brilliant and inspiring I'm sure to all the women here and everyone who's listening. And one of the themes has been having the importance of having supportive male managers, also having mentors, also have the institution, find some kind of formalistic ways of supporting people, but nothing compares with the experience of having a manager who crystallizes everything you aspire to be. And I had that with this lady. Part of the reason I got promoted to the division chief was, I'm sure, because of her support and promotion and pushing for that increment. But then I discovered that only Nancy can manage technical continuing research with managing a department, and it's superhuman. And that she does it all with modesty and constantly supporting the people around her rather than taking credit herself. Yeah. Anyways, it's been fantastic having the chance to work with you.
That's wonderful.
All right, over to Ishani for some closing words.
I'm not going to close. This is a beginning. I hope of another spurt of growth, this time a sustained one, and I think one that centers the lived experiences of women much more than we have in the past. So, Paul, thank you for that question. So I've been sort of trying to organize my thoughts along the lines of your question as well, which is, what can we do better? And I think I have 3 things that I want to talk about that I took away from these panels. The first is flexibility, and I'm going to say the least about this because I think we spoke the most about this at the very end. But whether it's decentralization or the insistence on FaceTime, or just being able to support women when they are faced with misbehavior. Institutions, IFIs, need to be much more flexible. Going back to Barbara, your first question about allowing women to choose, but they should also be allowed to distinguish between not wanting to be a manager or not thinking that they want to be a manager because the obstacles are so immense. So systems that are flexible, that give women the right to really take responsibility for their career in the face of systemic bias, rather than just saying it's on you, good luck, peace out, I think is really important. The next thing I want to talk about is intentionality. Mm-hmm. Oh, please. Okay. Well, so I was going to wrap this up and ask Nancy to come up here because we are in the House of Birdsall, as Alexia.
Don't. You were having some good thoughts. Just let me say a few words.
So why don't you come up here, Nancy?
You'll love the reason.
Okay.
Is this on? Can you? It doesn't matter. There we go. My husband is home with our sick grandson. And our sick grandson has arrived before we expected him, and later than I expected to leave. So I really apologize for interrupting, but he's sending me messages, and it's classic, right? No, but he's great. I chose a good husband. I did for that reason, maybe. I wanted to say how much I appreciate the program you put together and the research behind it. And just to say that, why is this place called the Birdsall House? And that's because colleagues some years ago wanted to find a way, after we'd moved into this building, to push the board members to give money. They needed an excuse, a good excuse, money that would help support creation of this beautiful conference center. And I said, please don't call it Birdsall. It's so embarrassing. Being a woman, I think, that was my first reaction. And so they said, yeah, well, we're going to do it anyway. So I said, if you do it, I want it to be once a year a conference on women in development. And that's why you're here. So it's very wonderful to have seen this research presented, to know that this research happened, to hear all of these wonderful women leaders talking about what it's like to be a woman in leadership in the IFIs. It got me thinking a lot about how it worked for me. There is an element of luck. For sure, women are too often leaning on luck instead of competence and experience, but there is an element of luck. Being an American, a lot of luck from the beginning. Maybe not so much now, but for sure from the beginning. Going to Catholic schools with nuns all through college and finding out, I was smart without that sense of any competition or embarrassment about being around men. Being old now, meaning that I was at the right age, at the right time, just in the US at the time of the second feminist movement, the women's liberation movement, when women all over the world started to push. And I think the only other thing I wanted to say, I had a lot of notes, it was so great to hear all of this, is somehow it does help to push. women have to find a way to do it in the right way, but you have to defend yourself and push. And I think it's something that all these leaders, women leaders we heard from, could be passing on more and more. Just push. Don't take no for an answer. I pushed several times in the World Bank when I felt I wasn't being treated fairly. And it was the men who supported me when I pushed. So go for it. Let's look again at the IFIs in some years. Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to say. It came up. What's the one thing you would recommend? Damn, and then I want to go back to Ishani while I leave. Oh, now is the time for a revolution among men in care, in the care issues. It shouldn't be only the women who are worried about care. And I did choose a good husband the second time. And he is home being a grandfather, and I have to rush home to meet him. Thank you, Ishani, and all of you.
All right, well, it was going to be hard enough to close this, and then topping that is next to impossible. So I'm just going to, very quickly list what I was going to say, which is authenticity is the last thing I wanted to talk about, other than flexibility and intentionality. That came up a lot, and I think that speaks to something that we've just scraped the tip of today, which is IFI culture. We need systems that are so robust that when there is bias, we've heard so many examples that have come up throughout the two panels of various forms of comments that are like death by 1,000 cuts, or explicit bias, or implicit bias. When something like that happens, for it to be deemed unacceptable in these workplaces, because we understand exactly who will take the brunt of those sorts of behaviors and of that sort of culture. Finally, thank you, Art, for the call for more data. I appreciate that very much. Thank you for helping us get the data that we did from the World Bank. I thought you were going to say, based on our collaboration there, you deemed it impossible to get any more. But I think more data would be wonderful. The stories that we've heard today are clearly those of more than the survivors, the people who've made it, who are the stars, and so there's clear selection there. And so I think I would love to look at attrition. Alan asked this great question about intersectionality. I'd love to look at this issue of the lateral moves. So Adana, for example, described not being able to find something that was a really good fit for her at this pinch point, and so she left the bank. Whereas Mamta, was able to move to analysis at a time when she needed it, and that worked for her. So to understand, what the issues are, what the solutions are that people find or sometimes don't, I think a lot more data would be fantastic. So let me end by simply, I had this beautiful little tribute to Nancy also planned, but now I don't get to give it, that's fine. I'll deliver it via email to her. But I just want to thank a few people. The first is our funder, Co-Impact, for funding this work and today's event. This has been really, personally, I think one of the most rewarding pieces of work that I've ever spent time on. And I wanted to thank Britt Robinson and Alba Loureiro, our program coordinator and the event coordinator, for just fantastic work on this. So thank you.